Good morning, everyone. I'm Mitch Graves, the chairman of Memphis Light, Gas, and Water's Board of Commissioners. And on behalf of my fellow commissioners who are all here and the executive team at Mlgw, we want to welcome you, want to welcome the city councilmen that are here with us this morning, and most importantly, our customers of Mlgw, especially those that are here. We are live streaming this meeting, and so I want to welcome our folks online, especially our customers. And I want to give special thanks to Councilman Jeff Warren, who really sort of pushed for us to jointly sit in a room and hear the information come from GDS. So thank you, Councilman Warren. You know, it's this process, it seems like it's been a long process. And we started with the power supply assessment and then went to the RFP process. Two separate deals, and it just seems like it's been a longer time. And over that time today, as I speak to especially the council and my fellow commissioners, you know, a lot has played out in the press. There's been a lot of external forces that have tried to mold the process. And the board and the executive team at Mlgw have multiple times stated, let the process work. Let's get to this point where we are today. And so with that, I want to ask everybody, and again, speaking specifically to the Board of Commissioners and the City Council members, that you keep an open mind during this process and that you remain curious as we go through this. This is a lot of detailed, sophisticated information that at the end of the day, in a few weeks, the Board of Commissioners will be brought an option that we will have to make a decision on. And one that may be the most important decision in the history of Mlgw. Definitely for decades to come. And so I ask that today, again, please be curious. Listen to understand what these folks are telling us. GDS has delivered. We've got, I think you'll find good information today. I hope we all do. But you've done it on time, so we thank you for that piece of it as well. Since we started this journey, though, I want each of you to be thinking, what has changed since we started this journey? The economy was great. There was virtually no supply chain issues. Inflation was non-existent. Gas costs, natural gas costs were low. And since we started this, all that's changed. And all that has to come into our decision-making process. So I know originally there were a lot of numbers thrown around, again, in the press. Today, it's hopefully we will drill down and better understand what those real numbers are so we can make a good decision. With that said, the process this morning is going to be, I'm going to turn it over here shortly to Chris Dawson to kick us off from GDS. After he's done, then we will turn over to our president, J.T. Young, to do sort of a wrap-up. And then we will move into a Q&A session. Now, the Q&A session is only going to be for commissioners and city council members. We are going to have some portals. I think those may be up here shortly, where the people listening online may submit their questions. And at a later time, we will post all this. It's important to us, the Board of Commissioners, as well as the executive team, that this be a transparent process. Again, solely because there's been so much press out there that we want everybody to feel comfortable that they're seeing the data and that what we are making our decision on. So today I ask you, if you've got your cell phone, if you wouldn't mind turning it off. Definitely on silent. I know everybody's got important things they need to be doing, but I need everybody clearly focused on this information. And that's because it is not a simple subject to grasp. So turn your phones off, let's focus. And again, everybody will have a chance, at least the council and commissioners, to ask questions later. So with that, thank you for being here. Let's get started. Chris, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Chairman Graves. Mark, can you hear me okay? Good morning, everyone. Yes, sir. Oh, I was just going to see if I'd get to the next slide with my clicker. So, Chairman Graves, my name is Chris Dawson. I'm with the consulting firm GDS Associates. We're based in Marietta, Georgia. We have offices across the United States. I'm a vice president in our power supply planning department. I've got about 30 years of experience working with municipalities, electric cooperatives, public power entities across the nation. I primarily help folks deal with complex power supply strategic issues, help them manage solicitation processes, contract negotiations, market integration, things of that nature. Very similar to a lot of the things that Chairman Graves mentioned about the journey that Mlgw has been on for the past 4 and 5 years. So today, if I can get the clicker to work. That's okay. You may have to drive the show, Richard. Technical difficulties, bear with us. I want to just review this agenda with you real quick. We do have about 55 slides that we're going to go over today. It's a lot of material. It's a lot of content. Just as far as our agenda, we want to start off talking a little bit about where have we been. Chairman Graves alluded to this. It has been a long process. It's something that, as an electric utility, you just don't turn on a dime. A lot of thought, a lot of investment, time, and update since the IRP, which was completed back in July and August of 2020. It's been almost 2 years since that was done. A lot of things have changed. We want to remind the audience where we're at, where we're going, how we're taking into account those changes as we look at updating our estimated savings. So the RFP Recount is just going to simply be a reminder about the RFP process, the criteria and metrics that we used, how we issued, distributed that RFP, the responses that we got back in summary, and then we're going to get into the proposal evaluation. This is where we're going to be scoring all of the proposals that we receive. We'll have those results. We'll be able to share that with everybody today. We'll talk a little bit about the specific criteria and metrics that were used to keep it as objective as possible in that scoring process. And then finally, the validation of the savings. This is where we're going to jump into and update the estimated savings that were originally determined by Siemens in the IRP process 2 years ago. And that was comparing resource alternatives to TVA. And specifically, a lot of that focus is going to be on the TVA long-term partnership agreement. So we'll get into that in that section. The sensitivity analysis, that is simply a process where you take a look at, okay, under a certain set of assumptions, here are my base case expectations for what the savings are going to be, and that's what was done in the IRP. We'll talk a little bit about that, as well as, okay, what if I change those assumptions, those key assumptions? What type of impact does that have on our savings? So we'll walk everybody through that, and then finally, we're going to look at non-financial risk, things that aren't easy to quantify but represent real risk with real financial consequences. And then President Young is going to walk us through some next steps, and then we're going to open up the floor for the board members, the city council members, for questions. We ask everybody, hold your questions until the end, and I recognize that it's going to be a long process, and maybe administratively, I think it's something that could be helpful, at least for me personally. If you see a particular slide and you know you're going to have a question about, write down the slide number so it may be easy for us to reference and get back to in terms of the context of the question. And with that, we can go to the next slide. So I thought it may be helpful just to start out with some general industry, electric industry related terms, things that most of you may not be familiar with in your everyday life. I have to live with a lot of these acronyms and terminology, you know, as with any industry. We've all got our lingo. But you're going to see some of these acronyms in the presentation, so I just wanted to touch on them just a little bit so that you may have a little bit better understanding or appreciation for them. The first one, BESS, battery energy storage. This is just a new technology. It's probably what you imagine is what's powering your Tesla vehicles and other electric cars. But it's just a battery that at a utility scale level, you can use as a temporary demand side management tool, demand reduction tool, and a temporary generator. It can be charged up and reduce load, it can discharge and provide more power. The capacity, this is a phrase, you may hear the term energy a lot, right? How much energy did I consume at my house? I don't know if we talk about capacity directly, but capacity is the ability to meet our peak demand, whether that occurs in 1 minute of a hot summer day, 1 hour of a hot summer day, at any point during the year. It's having the instantaneous capability to produce enough energy in that moment. And we talk about capacity in terms of a rating for a resource. We'll talk about 1,000 megawatts for a combined cycle, 500 megawatts of solar. That's all capacity. That's all its maximum capability is to produce energy in a moment. And then combined cycle, CCGT, and combustion turbine, those are two natural gas powered generation resources. They were specifically identified in the IRP as part of the portfolios, and the thermal, what we're going to refer to as thermal generation that have to be built here in Shelby County. Integrated resource plan, I know you've heard this IRP term a lot. I just want to remind everybody that we'll be talking about that throughout this presentation. And another term you're going to hear a lot about is TVA's long-term partnership agreement, the LTPA. Going to be doing a lot of comparisons against that. You're going to hear that phrase throughout. And of course, that is the amendment to the current agreement that other folks, other wholesale providers of TVA have chosen to take. And we'll get into some details about this and what it means. The Mid-Continent Independent System Operator, that is MISO. We're going to be talking a lot about MISO because they are they cover a region of 15 states. It's an independent nonprofit entity that basically operates a capacity energy ancillary services market. And the reason we're talking about them is because Mlgw at the edge of the TVA system butts up against MISO. And this is the alternative that everybody has been talking about. If we're leaving TVA, what we're doing is throwing some big transmission lines into MISO and interconnecting to that region. And probably want to make it also clear, right, MISO themselves are not a power seller, right? They're not selling energy and capacity, but they operate markets that facilitate those transactions. And then finally, RFP, request for proposal, which was the basis for why GBS is here today and what the path we've been on over the past 3 years. That's where we issued and managed a solicitation within Mlgw to procure some capacity resources that would complement, round out portfolios, the IRP portfolios 6 and 9. So where have we been? So Chairman Graves touched on this. I just want to touch on it a little bit as well. You know, it is a long journey, has been a long journey. None of these things happen quickly because of the enormous and complex financial decisions that have to be made. You know, we're talking about billion-dollar decisions here with Mlgw's future, the power supply resources and whatnot. It started, I think, maybe even a little bit before 2018, but basically Mlgw received unsolicited some proposals, some studies, proposals to sell power or buy power from alternative providers, studies that were done by third parties that suggested there were lots of savings to be had if Mlgw simply just considered some alternatives, predominantly to join MISO and build out a portfolio of resources. So the problem with those studies and those unsolicited offers is if you're not asking for it, how does anybody know what you need or what you want? So Mlgw decided that it would make a lot of sense to perform an integrated resource plan. That is something, a process that almost every major utility in the country, including TVA, do on a somewhat regular basis, about every 3 to 5 years. These are the types of activities, types of planning efforts that folks undergo. And why do they do this? Well, they do it because an IRP gives you an opportunity to think about what are the good options, what are the good things that we want to pursue versus the bad options. It allows you to put a lot of objectives, criteria, do a lot of stakeholder engagement, and in essence, you can bring together and identify in a very methodical manner what makes the most sense for the next steps. And that's what Mlgw did. And we're going to talk about this a little bit more and kind of where it led us to go, which was to issue some RFPs for transmission and generation. Of course, we did that back in 2021, and that's led us to here today, right? We've been evaluating, looking at all the proposals that we received, and bringing them together so we could update these savings. So, you know, what's all this effort for? What's all the fuss? I think everybody in the room, I'd like to think everybody in the room is aware that there are concerns about how much Mlgw is paying TVA for power today, and relative to alternatives that may provide lower power cost benefits for all of Mlgw's retail customers and stakeholders, the ability to prosper and continue to present and support great economic development in the community. So that's something that, especially when you're talking about the level, right? TVA's largest wholesale customer, that's Mlgw, that's Memphis. And it's not lost on anybody that unlike pretty much every single one of TVA's other wholesale customers, Mlgw does have a real opportunity to do something different. Some of y'all may be aware that no wholesale customers have successfully left TVA. They have a certain type of protection, certain type of legacy when it revolves around their transmission system, and that means that if you're going to leave TVA, you've got to do a lot of work. And I mean a lot of work and invest billions of dollars. So that's what the two, right? That's the argument. That's the pros and the cons about how we're figuring all this out. And so that's what's been driving these conversations for the last 4 or 5 years, right? What do we do to try to maximize our opportunities? What do we do to evaluate in a clear, objective manner, unbiased, what we could do, what it could look like, and how we can make it work? We can go to the next one. So I want to go ahead and talk about this LTPA and the existing TVA agreement because we are going to be focusing on this a lot throughout the presentation. And I think it's important for folks that aren't familiar. Today we are under a standard TVA agreement, and we have an option in front of us, the LTPA. That's basically just an amendment that TVA has offered to a number, I think they've offered to every one of their wholesale customers, and a large number of those wholesale customers have taken TVA up on this amendment. Well, what does it do? Well, the first thing it does, under your current agreement, you have a 5-year termination notice. If you sign the amendment, that 5-year termination notice now becomes a rolling 20-year notice. That is a long time, folks. It's a long time. Matter of fact, I'm not even familiar with agreements that have 20-year termination notices. But TVA is doing that for a reason, because with that, they also offer you some rate reductions, a 3.1% reduction on your base rates. That is not insignificant when you're buying $900 million of power each year. So the other thing is they also said, look, we can afford you some rate freeze protection on your base rates for 10 years, and we will allow folks to acquire renewables, other energy sources for up to 5% of their total energy requirements. So those are the attractive features. The detractors, of course, are the 20-year termination notice and the fact that TVA, I'm laughing for different reasons, but TVA has said, look, you don't have a stranded cost obligation. What stranded cost? That means if you decide to leave me, I am going to charge you, I'm going to send you a bill for all the investments that I made on your behalf for the past 20 years. And you get to write me a big check before you walk out the door. That was something that was a big issue back in the 90s, and your current arrangement actually dealt with it in 2002. There was an amendment that said, hey, there's no stranded cost obligation for anybody who gives their 5-year notice. But now, under the LTPA, there is. And so that's a big ticket item for anybody that has signed up, and it will make it difficult for folks to leave. I mean, if 20 years isn't already a problem, that stranded cost is going to be a big problem for folks who want to leave later. So it's not easy just to say, hey, why don't we just go sign up for the LTPA and figure this out later? It's not easy, but that is the situation and the arrangements. And so what we're doing as a part of the IRP did this, and we followed suit, which is to say, okay, what are my alternatives? What do they look like? And I'm going to compare that against the LTPA, only because it's the bird in hand. It's the one that would give me the lowest possible cost against TVA. So that's what we're going to be talking about throughout this presentation, but I did want to touch on that for just a few minutes. So some of these images on this slide are directly from the IRP presentation that was given to the Mlgw board back in August of 2020 by Siemens. And what I wanted to do was just remind everybody kind of this was the foundation that led us to the RFP process. So what we uncovered, what Siemens uncovered and Mlgw uncovered in the IRP process was they looked at engaging the community. They wanted to make this a transparent process. They formed a power supply advisory team. I think it was made up of about 20 folks from the business, the community. Those folks got together 11 or 12 times over the course of a year. There was also 3 public engagement meetings with the community. And the point was, let's get feedback from everybody, all of the Mlgw stakeholders about what's important to them, where do we need to go, what does this IRP need to accomplish, what should be the core objectives, the key criteria that we're going to evaluate our portfolios, right? Resiliency, reliability, cost effectiveness, stability, environmental impacts. And those are the types of criteria that the IRP used to ultimately determine that out of 11 resource portfolio alternatives, there were 3 that rose to the top and provided all of the metrics, checked all the boxes, and at the same time provided the most savings, potential savings, compared to the TVA LTPA. So that is what the RFP was focused on. And I mentioned 3, portfolios 6, 9, and 10. We'll get into a little bit of details about what's actually in those portfolios. But I wanted to just point out portfolio 10 got dropped in the RFP process because it had about 1,000 megawatt combined cycle facility, basically one power plant that would be located here in Shelby County. And it became a reliability concern, right? What happens when that plant was unavailable for whatever reason? So we removed that particular portfolio and just focused on portfolios 6 and 9. So then after that, that would get us down to developing and issuing the RFP that would be in alignment with what the IRP conclusions were. So this is a simple graphic. I owe some credit to my colleague Seth Frank for coming up with this originally. I like simple illustrations. It gets a lot of information across very quickly. This is nothing more than just to illustrate what the IRP portfolios 6 and 9 were designed to do. So there's a couple things going on here. One is, I mentioned MISO earlier, right? Basically, it's the power region that sits just outside of the TVA boundary and over in Mississippi and Arkansas. So one of the things that the IRP rightly concluded was, well, in order to get there, you need new transmission facilities. So we have new transmission facilities that was supported by a bunch of reliability studies, and then you need, and you're going to acquire, some wind and solar resources from that MISO region over there in Arkansas and Mississippi. But here at home, here in Shelby County, here in Memphis, you need hardcore generation because you can't support all of your load by just relying on imports across the river or from Arkansas and Mississippi. So what the IRP said is, look, we need some thermal generation, right? Natural gas burning generation. That's your CTs, your combined cycles, and your combustion turbines, CTs, CCGTs. And so those would be located right here. That'd be about 1,200 megawatts. You'd have another 1,000 megawatts of solar here in Shelby County. And that 2,000 plus megawatts would support your load in addition to what you could import and bring in from MISO across the river in Arkansas and from Mississippi. So that's how the totality of resources would be brought to bear to serve our 3,200 megawatt load here in Memphis. So we, as a part of all of that though, right, it's not just about what you've got to acquire, it's also about removing yourself from the TVA system. So you have all this existing infrastructure, of course, because TVA serves all of our load today, and all of those things would have to be, cut off, and so that we were in essence isolated from TVA and completely dependent on our new portfolio. So this is just a simplistic illustration of what the IRP portfolios 6 and 9 were designed, how they were built up, and it's the basis for the RFPs that we issued, right? We issued RFPs seeking new transmission facilities, renewable resources, thermal generation. That was the key focus, and that's what we're going to be talking about next. And before we talk about that, I want to update everybody on, again, Chairman Graves kind of touched on this. It's been 2 years since the IRP. Let's talk about, and I'm just going to keep this at a quick level here, but I want to talk about the things that have changed over the past 2 years, things that I think most of you are probably aware of. And I'm going to keep this just in the context of what it means for an electric utility. So natural gas prices. I'm not sure how closely you'll follow natural gas prices, but it's been a wild ride, and partly because of geopolitical events, partly because of demand for natural gas. But when the IRP was going on, we were in one of the lowest natural gas pricing environments in the past 20 years. Natural gas had actually been trending down for the previous 10 years. And I tried to illustrate on this timeline here, which basically this chart on your lower left starts in 2016, runs out to 2028. Historically, gas prices have been trending down. The IRP was in a moment where it was continuing to do that. It was great. Power costs were super low. Everybody loves this time. If you can follow that chart, that gas prices have more than quadrupled basically since that time. That's a lot of change. As a matter of fact, I think they were just capping out over $9. This chart is even that up to date. In the past week, we've actually been up over $9. And I'm trying to remember the last time it was there. It was like 2007, 2008 briefly. Where is it going to go from here? I don't know. I don't think anybody does, not if they're being honest with you. Forward curves suggest that gas prices will come back down to $4 or $5. Here's why I'm telling you all this. the IRP made some assumptions for the future, like all IRPs and planning efforts do. And we just want to be cognizant of what their assumptions were based on the latest and greatest information they had at the time. Does it mean it's right? Does it mean it's wrong? There's no telling. Like, we still don't know what gas prices will be in 2028 or 2029. Just want everybody to be aware that may not be the right assumption. So, since we've got portfolios here, portfolios 6 and 9, that have some exposure to natural gas because they will be burning natural gas, that means you could experience a change in your power cost. That's the whole point of bringing this up. You go to the next slide. What else? What else is starting to change? Capacity prices. When the IRP was being done several years ago, they were giving capacity away. Who's they? Other suppliers, providers, right? There was so much surplus capacity, you could procure it relatively inexpensively for short periods of time. What's changed? Well, MISO just experienced their annual auction. That's a process they do every year. Again, 15-state region. So they have a northern region, I'm going to call it MISO North, and the southern region, MISO South. The northern region cleared at the highest possible price the auction allows. It's only for 1 year, and I'm trying to demonstrate with this chart on the bottom right. It's only a 1-year price, but historically, prices at that auction have cleared at very low prices. Where is it going? What's going to happen next year? I don't know. Simply point out it's volatile, could be more volatile. Why? MISO said, why did they have this high price? A lot of people are asking this question. MISO said, well, there's a couple of things going on, right? We've seen higher load growth. We've had some more thermal plant retirements. You start factoring those things, and MISO has to make sure that they still maintain reliability and appropriate reserve margin, planning reserve margin, right? They need a little bit of buffer. They said, look, this is the price that's cleared for the auction because of all, you bring in the combination, all those things. It's only for 1 year. Next year, the price is going to be different. Nobody knows exactly what it's going to be. The other thing that's interesting is NERC. That's the National Energy Reliability Council. They basically are in charge with, on a nationwide level, just kind of overseeing everything that's going on in terms of reliability, right? They're trying to make sure electric utilities are keeping the lights on. Well, NERC came out with their annual summer assessment. They issued it last month, and they said, look, we've got some concerns here. As we look across the country, we think there are some potential issues for rolling blackouts, for the ability for people to lose load over the summer, right? You could have hotter weather, you've got wildfires out west, you've got low drought conditions, whatever it is, this is their assessment. Again, it's something they do every year, and this year they said, look, there's some real concerns in the Midwest and the western parts of the country. So again, I don't know what the price of capacity is going to be in the future. I wish I did. What I do know is the IRP made an assumption, again, based on the conditions at the time where capacity was widely available. And the assumption was there would be surplus capacity available to sell. Again, is that right or wrong starting in 2028? I don't know. But I want you to be aware that that is an assumption in the IRP that is going to impact your power cost. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in the sensitivity portion of the presentation. You can go to the next slide. So I'm just going to hit this real quickly. It's just interest and inflation rate. We're all living with it. Anybody tried to refinance a home recently or purchase a home? I can appreciate where you're at, believe me, right? 6 months ago, we could have gotten much lower interest rates than we can today. None of us can control those interest rates. However, underlying those interest rates, of course, is inflation. I know everybody's aware, since COVID, logistic constraints, whatever you want to call it, wage pressure, shortage in the labor market. I'm not even sure what all drives the inflation rates, but we're at the highest rates since 1980. 40 years, and we're at the highest rates. And it hasn't been a slow, steady increase, folks. It has been a ramp up. It's like Evel Knievel taking off. And that's what this chart up here on the right demonstrates. Why is this a big deal? Well, when the IRP was being done, It was assuming low inflation, low interest rates. Why does that matter? Well, it matters because if you're going to go finance billions of dollars of plants and transmission, you'd rather do it at a low interest rate than a high interest rate. No difference than buying a home, right? Lower interest rates mean lower money out of our pockets. This will have an impact on where our future is and what our future power cost is. What are interest rates going to be in 2028? I don't know. I just know the IRP had an assumption based on the current environment, and today's environment is not the same. Finally, just real quickly, because the IRP was focused on 3,000 to 4,000 megawatts of solar capacity for the two portfolios, 6 and 9, that means you're going to be buying a significant amount of energy from solar, and the IRP had some assumptions about what that cost of solar would be. Well, 2 years have passed. The environment's starting to change. We've seen an uptick in solar pricing. I guess you could say the solar industry's been facing some headwinds. It was complicated when the U.S. Department of Commerce negotiated the basically equivalent of a fraud violation on tariffs from some Southeast Asian companies that threw the solar industry into a tizzy. Just earlier this week, President Biden said, look, executive order, we ain't got time for this. We're going to put those tariff issues at abeyance for 2 years. Gives the solar industry some breathing room. Those types of things, nobody can predict, right? Nobody was expecting those types of things to happen. They can happen in the future. They may not. Who knows? Maybe solar prices will go up and then they'll come back down because there'll be some kind of magical breakthrough and the world will settle down and all of a sudden we'll have widely available materials, commodities, labor will be cheap. But I don't know when all that's going to happen. We did do an RFP to get some solar information. We'll actually get into that a little bit. But I just want to make you aware, another example of things that can change and they can change quickly. And that affects our power costs and our future power costs, our expected power costs. So we are done talking about these things that have changed since the IRP. And again, I've talked a lot about why this is important. I want everybody to just keep that in mind. So I know I've kind of put a lot of oh, this is dangerous, this is scary. I will say this, when we talk about later in the presentation this morning about savings and how much we think we can save, we're going to be using, in those analysis and those calculations, a lot of assumptions that the IRP had. So we're still taking some information from the IRP that was, hey, it's a rosy future. And that's what you're going to see as our base case, right? That's what we're going to present. We're going to supplement that with cost and performance information from the RFPs for the transmission, the generation, the solar. But that base analysis is still using a lot of components from that IRP. We'll talk about potential different outcomes when we get to the sensitivity analysis. So just I think I only have 2 slides here, talking a little bit about the RFP process itself. So the IRP, predicated how much transmission, the type of transmission facilities we needed to successfully, reliably serve our load and to interconnect to MISO. So we put together an RFP to do that. Same thing for the thermal and the renewable. Somebody may ask, why'd you do 3 RFPs? And that's a great question. There's two good answers. The first one is, if I need to build transmission facilities, and we're talking a lot of transmission, I need to be able to give folks that build transmission facilities out in the world, I need to give them design specifications. I need to tell them exactly what I want, how I want it, where I want it, what it should look like. And so those folks are now going to receive the RFP for transmission, right? These are the folks that build transmission. What those folks don't want to see is something for solar, right? They could care less about solar. Tell me about transmission. I breathe transmission. So we designed an RFP for those folks, for those facilities, and we sent it out. The other thing to keep in mind, and the other important reason why there were 3 RFPs, is because of the amount of time that somebody needs to prepare a response for a transmission project is different. It's longer than a thermal generation project, which is different and longer than a solar project or other alternatives. So 3 RFPs to specifically address what we wanted. We didn't want anybody to be confused about what we wanted. We wanted to be real clear. We wanted to lay it out for them. Here's what the IRP portfolio has asked for. This is what we're seeking. So we got that out. I think at the end of the day, these 3 RFPs basically made their way to over 700 contacts at like 300 different companies, made it into the trade press. If you were anybody in the industry, you knew about this. Heck, I was getting calls about stuff. And Mlgw managed and procured this whole thing, the distribution of the RFP. But even GES, people were calling, you know about this RFP? Yeah, we're aware of it. So it was out there in the entire world, for the entire world to see. And anybody who was interested had a chance to respond. Now, this is something that I think is really important. You know, the IRP laid that foundation and that groundwork, and it specifically said, hey, you need to focus on 6 and 9. However, there were 4 points that the Mlgw board considered back in March of 2021. That was a collaborative effort, and those 4 points said, look, we know what the IRP said. However, we need to make sure we don't close the door to any other alternatives, whether that be some type of generation somewhere else, if that happened to be an entity that wanted to come in and provide us with the same type of arrangements they have from TVA today. You may hear me use the term full requirements. Full requirements is an industry term, means somebody's just wrapped me up to give me everything I need, the transmission service, the power, capacity. I don't do anything but just keep going about my life. That's what TVA does today, right? They put their arms around you, they give you a good hug, they keep you warm. That's what we have. That's full requirements. So one of the things we did in the RFP, in the renewables and other alternatives RFP, aptly named, is we said, look, what if you're interested in giving us full requirements, then please, by all means, do so. Don't let us stop you. Here's what we're looking for. Here's what we need. Here's what TVA does today. Give it to us. And we did receive proposals. So just so everybody knows, it actually did work. We asked for alternatives. People gave us alternatives. And again, just making this point, the 4 points covered a few other things. They said, look, similar to the IRP, you have got to have clear criteria, objectives, and metrics that you're going to use to score, right? We need folks that are creditworthy. We don't want fly-by-night operations. We need folks that are going to be real clear about their cost. We need folks that are going to have tremendous experience. We can't just take a chance that somebody's going to come in and try to build us a project, and this is their first rodeo. None of that. So we adhere to that by making it real clear in the RFP that that's what we were looking to do. And so some of the other points, for example, one was just to present all of this information to the City Council and the board, which we're doing today. So wanted to let you know, we did adhere to those, we respected those, they were important to Mlgw, and we made sure that the RFP process accomplished that. So RFPs were issued, all of them were issued last year. Like I said, some of them have longer lead times than others in terms of folks preparing responses. So we got the transmission RFP out first, followed by the thermal RFP, followed by the renewables and others. The generation and the renewable RFPs, we received all of those proposals in early December, and then transmission proposals were received early in February. So what did we get back? We were very pleased. Mlgw was very pleased with the robustness and the competitiveness of the solicitations that received. So for example, we had 5 thermal generation proposals. That was for combined cycle combustion turbines, represent a little over 5,500 megawatts. Those folks got those proposals in, and then that was also accompanied by, on the renewable resources, it's a very competitive market, folks. It really is. There's a lot of entities out there, and the RFP showed that, and this is very typical of what GDS sees in other working with other clients and other similar RFPs. But in this case, 17 local solar projects, basically local meaning here in Shelby County, interconnected to the Mlgw transmission system. That represented over 2,100 megawatts of capacity. I do want to emphasize this. Some folks may ask, well, wait a minute, the IRP just said you only need 1,000 megawatts of solar. Well, what the IRP was really saying is, hey, we can only fit 1,000 megawatts of solar here in Shelby County. So you need a lot of land for solar, right? You can't stack up solar panels. They've got to be spread out over a lot of land. And because of the land that is available here in Shelby County, the IRP said, look, on a good day, we can fit in about 1,000 megawatts. So you see up here 17 projects, 2,000 megawatts. A lot of those projects are basically in the same plots of land, occupying the same space, because they do what all solar developers do. Where does the sun shine and where is it flat? I don't want to build on a mountain. I don't want to build in a swamp. They're doing the same thing. So that's kind of how they worked it out. But now, what's interesting, we got 21 projects that were located in Arkansas and Mississippi, representing about, I think it was over 4,900 megawatts of capacity. That's a lot. But the interesting thing there is a number of those projects, in one way or the other, are actually already underway. So it's not like somebody's coming and going, oh, I got to build, I'm not really sure where I'm going to get permitting. Some of these projects are already like, hey, we've got a plan, we own the land, we're clearing the land, we're doing stuff, we're ordering modules. So that was interesting. And by the way, that's what gives you a lot of confidence that it's legitimate, right? Somebody's already doing it, whether you come along or not. So folks gave us pricing for all of that, and we were, again, real responsiveness here. It does bode well and informs us a lot when you get this type of competitive response. It's a true indication of what the market really is. And then finally, I think I mentioned this earlier, we did also receive, as part of the other alternatives that we had asked for, 3 partial full requirements arrangements. And so we also evaluated those, and we'll talk a little bit about that later in the presentation. So, you can go to the next slide, Richard. So, the proposal evaluation. What I hadn't mentioned, I've introduced myself, of course, as GDS, and actually have a colleague here, Seth Frank from GDS. Who I didn't mention was part of this venture is an engineering firm known as Stanley Consultants. They were immensely helpful. They're about 1,000 employee firm headquartered in the Midwest. They have nationwide international operations. But what they do is build, design, develop generation and transmission projects. So I call them real engineers, right? They are out there turning wrenches, making things happen, getting sweaty. And so they were really, really important here as we went through this process of trying to assess and evaluate the technical capabilities, viabilities of these different resources. So what I've got up here on this slide is some actual images from our thermal generation and our renewable RFP, and these images represent the criteria that we laid out for folks and said, look, this is how we're going to score you. Let's don't kid ourselves. It's pretty transparent. It's pretty straightforward. Know what you're getting into, right? 70% of the scoring, the weighting, is going to be non-cost. So you can give us a low cost, but you better be able to deliver on all these other things. These other things are also adhering to one of the Mlgw's 4 points, right? And that was to make sure folks that participate have the capability to pull this off. So, these criteria and metrics are important because it allows you to be objective, it allows you to be upfront. You're not pulling any punches on anybody, right? I told you this is how I was going to score you. I showed you how I was going to do it. You need to give me the information in order to do that. So we had forms. Mlgw provided bid forms that people had to populate with all the information. And it was a lot of information. right? You don't just go about building a transmission facility, you know, $700 million worth without getting a lot of details done. Same thing for 1,000 megawatts of thermal generation. You need a lot of information about how those things are going to perform and your experience doing it. So this is something that's going to drive the next couple of slides, because what we're going to show you is how we scored all the bidders that participated in the various RFPs. One thing I will mention, there was a 5-point bonus that could be awarded to folks for anybody that had that was a diverse firm or was operating a minority enterprise. So Mlgw did score folks that qualified for those criteria up to an additional 5 points in the scoring. You trust any of this? So the first one I want to talk about is the thermal generation RFP. So as a reminder, when I say thermal generation, I am talking about those combined cycles and that combustion turbine. Again, that was roughly going to be about 1,200 megawatts of thermal capability right here in Shelby County. So remember I mentioned we had 5 proposals. So what you see up here on this chart, and the rest of the chart's going to be very similar to this, what you see is on the far left is just the ideal total scoring. In other words, if somebody was perfect in every category, they could score up to 105 in our rating system. What we did was we went through methodically evaluating and comparing and scoring each of the proposals on basically 4 different criteria. And these are general criteria, right? One was pricing. One was performance guarantees. In other words, did they stand behind, you know, if their power plant didn't do X, Y, and Z? Were they going to provide compensation for it not doing that? The other thing, of course, that was, you know, really critical was, you know, the technical capability of what their proposal consisted of, their technical capability to do it, and then, of course, their experience. Have you done this before? Have you put these things together? Are your clients happy with what you've done? So we looked at all that in addition to the additional 5% score for diversity. And this is how, this chart here illustrates how the total score added up for the 5 bidders. And so, you know, you see almost 4 of these guys here, you know, roughly around 80-something%, which, by the way, we score hard. I just want to be real clear about that. We score hard, but fair, and 80-something% is an excellent score. It is an excellent score. So, again, remember, price only made up 30% of the score. So 70%, right, is non-price related. From this, the only thing I want to leave you with from this slide is we did receive 5 proposals, but when we were moving forward with our validation and comparison of the savings, we only took the top 3 bids here and used that as the basis for updating the IRP assumptions for the cost of thermal generation. Ooh, I forgot to drop it. Okay, next one, local solar, very similar chart. Lots of participation here. Again, remember 17 projects, 2,100 megawatts. Same approach. You know, we looked at what folks were offering, their capabilities, you know, the performance, history, experience. Again, price only made up 30% of the total score. I'm very pleased with the responses we received in this case. Moving forward with the RFP and the updating of the savings, we used bids from the top, or proposals from the top 5 bidders. And then, very similar for the MISO solar. I am only, just so you know, I'm only discerning between local solar and MISO solar because you actually had different parties, different entities participate in those processes. And there were some that participated in both, but you also had a lot of different entities participating. So and we also had to look at things a little bit differently, right? If a project's in MISO, there was a couple of different implications versus if a project was in Shelby County or was local. We had to determine how that local project was going to interconnect to the Mlgw transmission system. So just a little bit of distinction. Otherwise, right, everything is about the same. Solar panels, solar facilities generate renewable energy. From this information, as we move forward to the savings, the validation analysis, we took the top 4 bidders here. You can probably, I think it's pretty clear on this chart in particular, you can kind of see how the top 4 bidders, there's like a little bit of a step function when you get to the last 3 bidders in terms of the scoring. So this made a lot of sense to us in terms of using some of the best to get to the updated savings analysis. And then finally, I say finally, we're still going to talk about transmission, which is what my colleague Seth Frank is going to cover. But finally, from my perspective on the power supply side, it was the partial and the full requirements. Remember I mentioned we had 3 proposals, so we scored and we evaluated those as well. And we ended up using one, the best one, the one that made the most sense as the basis for comparing TVA and portfolio 6 and 9. And we'll talk about that comparison, that economic comparison, later in the presentation. But also similar to the other ones, cost was only 30% of the total score. Again, focused on experience, creditworthiness, the ability to pull this off, and especially when you're talking about something of this magnitude, right? There are very few entities in the nation that can pull this off. You are a 3,000 megawatt load. Not everybody can tackle that. As a matter of fact, it's probably like this when you think about folks outside of TVA. It's on one hand. And so we were pleased that we got some alternatives that you need to take into account. If you're going to jump into bed with somebody else, they better be qualified on a number of fronts. So we did take this into consideration. We did evaluate that, and like I said, we'll touch on that later in the presentation. Now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Everybody hear me okay? Yes. I'm Seth Frank. I'm Vice President of Transmission Services for GES Associates. I started my career a little bit earlier than Chris. Back in 1980, I was a co-op student at Florida Power and Light. Worked there for a few years after college and moved on to Oglethorpe Power, which is the generation transmission supplier in Georgia to the co-ops. And then for the past 20 years, I've been at GES Associates consulting with municipals and cooperatives in the transmission space. So what I want to cover today is the transmission RFP results, as well as the overall transmission cost needed to integrate Mlgw into MISO to be able to, glean all those benefits that were identified in the IRP. So here's a little graphic I put together. I know it's a little bit crude, but I think it'll get the point across. So what Siemens determined in the RFP as part of the portfolio development was, in addition to the generation that was internal to Mlgw that Chris has covered, the combined cycle and simple cycle combustion turbines and the 1,000 megawatts of solar generation located in Mlgw service territory, they also identified the need to have 2,400 megawatts of firm import capability from MISO to Mlgw. And that is, the largest, most complex part of this process. If you see here up in the right is TVA. Obviously, this is not to scale. I'm not trying to insult TVA because they're obviously much larger than Mlgw in scale. But currently, there are 4 500,000 volt points of delivery where TVA delivers power to Mlgw. And that's done over 13 different transmission lines. So the assumption in the IRP, along with studies performed by MISO, assume that these interconnections would be severed in 2028 when MLGW made the switch to MISO South. So those get cut, basically get eliminated. TVA, of course, still has other connections to MISO and Southern Company and PJM and everybody else. But what the RFP had bid out was the addition of 3 new transmission lines. These orange ones are 500 kV transmission lines going from a new Shelby, which is a new transmission substation that will be constructed in MLGW service territory. And this is also in scope of the RFP. That 500 line will cross the Mississippi River and terminate into Entergy's system, Entergy Arkansas system, which is part of MISO South. Same here, there would be a new Allen substation constructed, transmission substation, and a new 500 kV line running from New Allen also to Entergy Arkansas, also crossing the Mississippi River. So 2 very large, very expensive transmission lines. And then finally, a third line was identified. This blue line here is a 230,000 volt line that will run from the New Allen substation to Entergy, Mississippi, down at a place called Twinkletown. So that establishes 2,400 megawatts of firm import capability. In addition to that, we also Siemens and MISO both identified the need for MLGW to upgrade its existing 161 kV transmission network, the existing system. And you say, well, why? You know, that already exists. Well, you fundamentally changed the physics here. You've eliminated the traditional source of supply from TVA. So you've isolated that, you know, those interconnections, they no longer exist. You've installed, as Chris mentioned, over 2,000 megawatts of generation in MLGW service territory. And you've also constructed 3 new transmission lines or 3 new interconnections with MISO South. So all that has to be taken into account when you're looking at the existing network. All the power flows change, physics change. So all that has to be accounted for. In addition, as you'll see here in a minute, the RFP included the 2 substations and the 3 transmission lines up to the point of interconnection with Entergy. So this is Entergy service territory in Arkansas, Mississippi, and Entergy maintains that they have the right of first refusal to build any transmission facilities within their service territory. And that is the assumption we ran with. So we, or MLGW, requested that Entergy provide a cost estimate to do those last connections from MLGW's facilities to Entergy's facilities. So we've got that in addition here in the presentation. So again, we've got 3 buckets of capital costs here to determine the total transmission integration cost. I discussed the transmission RFP, which is the 2 substations and the 3 transmission lines up to the MISO South border. We had the Entergy constructed portion of those 3 transmission lines and modifications that Entergy needs to do to their existing substations to connect those lines. And then finally, the 3rd bucket of costs was those internal upgrades needed to allow for the dispatch of that 2,000 megawatts of generation, as well as bringing in all that firm power and economic power from MISO. And so this was all identified in the IRP document by Siemens, as well as supported through studies that were performed by MISO, and that membership assessment report that includes that analysis has been posted on the MLGW website. So MISO's estimate for that whole set of costs, their capital costs, was $736 million. And Siemens, since theirs was a little bit older, as Chris mentioned, inflation, supply chain, what have you, their Siemens cost was more down, cost estimate was more in the $720 million. But all in all, about $750 million worth of upgrades were identified. That is what we're going to call the base case. Okay, so again, we went to the market. We worked with Stanley Consultants, and we worked with Mlgw engineering staff and procurement staff and system operations staff to develop the transmission RFP. We got very specific. We said Mlgw wishes to have a party engineer and construct these facilities with ownership transfer to Mlgw. And you say, well, you know, why does Mlgw want to own those transmission facilities? Well, it's pretty simple. There's two reasons. Number one is cost. Mlgw's cost of financing is much lower than what a third-party transmission developer will charge Mlgw to own, operate, and maintain those transmission facilities. In MISO, transmission companies get to earn an incentive rate of return. It could be up to nearly 10%. And 10% rate of return is much higher than Mlgw's borrowing costs. The second reason, and probably the more important reason, is if you don't own those transmission interconnections and you allow a third party to own it, you have pretty much foreclosed on your opportunity to do something else in the future. Makes it much more difficult. Who owns the transmission gets to determine their destiny. I mean, that's just, you know, as Chris said, the only reason that you're here today, you were able to undergo this process, is because Mlgw owns its transmission system and it borders Entergy and MISO. Lacking ownership of transmission will make it very, very difficult to have an option other than to renew with TVA. So we bid out those transmission facilities. We ranked here. There's the perfect score. Again, it could be up to 105%. The weighting was a little bit different. We put a little bit more emphasis on the big cost at 40%, and then the non-financial categories, were the balance of the 60% plus the 5% bonus, diversity bonus for the bidders. And so we had two, what we'll call conforming bids that we evaluated. We had one non-conforming bid that was submitted that was for third party to own and operate those facilities. That bid, while it was non-conforming for the transmission RFP, is being used in the full requirements RFP that Chris mentioned. So you mentioned the full requirements RFP includes everything you need: transmission service, capacity, energy, ancillary services. So that non-conforming bid, while it was non-conforming here, is being used to calculate the value of the full requirements proposals. So the highest scoring the two, and they were close, was 24 out of the 40 on the initial scoring. Now, it was the higher of the two bid costs, but the reason we ranked it higher, even though the price was higher, was simply because it was firm pricing. We asked for firm pricing, and they gave us firm pricing. The firmness, of course, is somewhat limited. They have escalation clauses in there, obviously, for commodities like steel and concrete and labor, because of the rising interest rate environment, inflation environment we're in today. They have those in there, but we evaluated them on the price they gave us. The second one was just slightly lower bid price. However, it was not firm. What this vendor had proposed was what is called in the industry a progressive design build. And that's simply where I haven't done all the homework. I haven't as MLGW, I have not engineered these facilities. I haven't done the siting studies or the environmental studies or the routing studies, permitting, so all that stuff that has to be done. So we don't know exactly where the transmission lines will be located, exactly where the towers are going to be placed. So this bidder said, hey, I'm not going to give you a firm price and take on that risk. So I'm going to propose a progressive design build arrangement where I'll go with you arm in arm MLGW through this engineering procurement process. You'll have veto power. However, the costs are going to be whatever the costs are. So it was not firm pricing. In addition, they required all 3 transmission lines and substations to be awarded as a package deal. Okay, so that was the first bucket. The second bucket of costs for the energy constructed ties. Remember the portion of the transmission lines across into Entergy service territory. Entergy provided this number. It's what we call a Class 5 estimate. It was about $176 million. And what was interesting here is Entergy agreed to allow MLGW to finance the cost of these facilities. So rather than pay, again, Entergy's enhanced rate of return, MLGW gets to have these facilities constructed and they get to finance them at their cost of borrow. The last bucket, remember I have those 3 buckets, 3 balls in the funnel. The last one is the MLGW upgrades and other capital costs. I talked at length already about the reinforcements to the existing 161 kV network to allow for that 2,400 megawatts of import capability, to allow for the dispatch of that combined cycle, simple cycle, and solar power that's within MLGW service territory. So it's quite a bit of work involved, and working with MLGW engineering staff, we've come up with about $511 million in capital costs. 2 others that go into this bucket is an assumption here that MLGW will have to reimburse TVA to reconnect their Allen combined cycle generating plant, because that is physically connected to MLGW today, and if MLGW reconnects to MISO, TVA will not have the power off that facility anymore, so it'll have to be reconnected, disconnected from MLGW and reconnected to TVA at a cost of about $55 million. And then there's about $5 million in other costs that Siemens identified, upgrades to systems, MLGW system operations. And so that totals about $571 million in total costs. The one thing to note here, you say, well, why didn't Siemens or MISO identify that? Well, it's simply a matter of they identified the need for upgrades to happen on MLGW's existing network. They only had estimated about $184 million in costs. So we've got over a $300 million difference here, which is significant, and will play a role into the final evaluated cost of power under these new arrangements. But to Siemens' credit, they did note, and you can see that in the IRP, they noted, hey, we've given you this estimate, but really MLGW has to undergo a detailed engineering analysis to determine exactly what it's going to take. So again, Siemens had estimated 184, but Siemens stated, hey, final determination on the list of facilities for reinforced and associated cost estimates is subject to full detailed engineering review prior to implementation. And so that is what MLGW has done. Their staff has undergone this detailed engineering review, and they have a lot of documentation to support this. So it's about a $327 million increase over the RFP, and it includes 40 miles of new 161 kV transmission lines and 5 new 161 kV switching stations. as well as a bunch of upgrades to other facilities, substations, and transmission lines. The impact of major construction-related outages to the Mlgw system and potential regulatory requirements were considered. In other words, you just can't go in and just modify facilities. They have to be, while they're energized, they have to be taken out of service. These are long lead time projects. They'll take many years to engineer and construct. And so that had to be taken into account. You just can't switch things out of service and start working on them in the middle of the summer. So that had to be taken into account, and that drives a lot of that cost. And we want to make sure that there's no sacrifice of system reliability and service to Mlgw customers during that time of construction, which would be at least a 5-year period. So where does this leave us? Again, the 3 buckets of costs. So we're looking, all told, an increase because of the detailed engineering analysis, inflation, interest rates rising. We're now up to total capital cost of $1.2 billion for transmission, new transmission and transmission upgrades. And so that's a total increase of 465, which is the 327 I mentioned, plus increases in costs for the other buckets. So fairly substantial difference, and again, that does, impact the final analysis of the all-in power cost.
So,
Want to take a break?
you want
10 minutes.
break? All right. So tell you folks, we're going to take a 10-minute break right now, and then we're going to come back to pick up the presentation. That's exciting. All right, everyone, we'll start back up. So the conclusion where we just left, where we were just talking about the evaluation process, we were walking everyone through, the proposals we received, the scoring, how we were taking some of the best of those proposals, and we're going to use those for the validation of the savings, which is what we're going to talk about next. So just a couple of things. You may have noticed that our IRP portfolios talked about wind. It's actually 400 megawatts of wind that was going to be procured from the MISO region and imported into Mlgw. We did not receive any wind proposals in the RFP process. Although we asked for it, we just didn't receive it. Probably a number of reasons for that. So what we did in order to kind of complement and round out the portfolio was we used some battery energy storage systems and combined with some additional solar. And that was just to replace the capacity and energy that we had expected to have from the wind resources. So the other thing we did is thinking about the renewable with solar for the local projects as well as the MISO projects. Remember, that was 3,000 to 4,000 megawatts of solar capacity. We did use the top 9 solar proposals. That I think that actually may be different than what's in your package. I think we said 10. That was just a typo. So it is the top 9 proposals. That's just a combination of the local bidders and the MISO South bidders. And then finally, as I mentioned in the thermal generation, we did take the top 3 proposals. We're going to wrap all of that up. We're going to update the IRP assumptions with all the cost and performance information that the IRP assumed is now going to be replaced with this new real-world RFP information, right? This is what folks are telling Mlgw, what they're willing to build and sell at the cost for these resources. And of course, the other thing is the transmission facilities and that investment that my colleague Seth Frank mentioned earlier. So we're now going to jump right into the validation of the savings. So, yeah, just so everybody knows, we are passing out the second half of the presentation. It's about another 20 slides. So I hope everybody has that, can follow along. But, as a reminder, you can go to the next slide, or you don't let me do it. So the validation of the savings. Thank you. So what does that mean? What are we talking about here? So I believe everyone is familiar that during the IRP process, the way they walked through, Siemens walked through comparing portfolio 6 and 9 to the expected cost from TVA over a 15-year window, that was their estimate to say, hey, this is how much potential savings could be achieved if you were to invest and pursue these two other portfolios. So what we're doing today is simply updating a few assumptions for the cost of those resources, the capability and the performance of those resources. And that's only associated with the thermal generation, the renewable resources, and the transmission facilities. The first 4 items that I show you on this table, those are assumptions that were used in the IRP by Siemens. They represent roughly about 40% of Mlgw's total power cost. And so all of the information that we're going to talk about on the next several slides is a combination of those IRP assumptions for those 4 items, as well as the information that we received in the RFP. Again, RFP proposals, this is what folks are telling you in Mlgw. We're willing to sell you power at this much, we're willing to do this, we're guaranteeing these type of performance from these resources. This is as good as it gets in terms of validating our opportunity relative to what we're paying TVA today. So, you know, we're going to also, and I want to remind everyone that, you know, these assumptions here from the IRP, these first 4 items, gas, capacity, interest, inflation, and whatnot, you know, we're leaving those the same for this base case, but we are later in the presentation going to look at a sensitivity analysis. And all that means is we're going to test our savings and see how sensitive they are to different assumptions, right? Could be better, could be worse, but that's what we're going to do. So I want to remind everybody, we will get to that a little bit later. So kind of teeing this up, I just want to use this slide right here, a little bit of a transition. I want to walk everybody through kind of our roadmap, our game plan for how we're going to do this effort. So, you know, the first thing, and I mentioned this at the outset of the presentation, the first thing we're going to do is update our expected cost from TVA. And that's nothing more than saying, okay, the IRP used a model to project TVA's cost. All we did was look at that model and say, what are some things that we're aware of today that we didn't know 2 years ago? We're going to update those LTPA expected costs. Then we're going to update the IRP portfolio cost for 6 and 9, again, based on information from the RFP proposals. Next step from there is, right, we can make a comparison. We can also now blend in the full requirements proposal that I mentioned earlier, right? We received a couple, we took the best one. We want to make a comparison against that as well. And then we're going to move our way down because there's something, and I'm not sure how much of this has been really talked or discussed before, but, you know, I mentioned earlier in the presentation, there's in your current agreement with TVA, you have a 5-year termination notice. It's a pretty reasonable notice in terms of contracts. However, if you were to decide you were moving forward and you gave that 5-year notice, well, that means you're still under your current arrangement today, and you can't get to any savings until 5 years down the road. And by the way, that's optimal, right? I give that notice, let's say what we assumed was the beginning of 2023, the beginning of 2028. I'm now under this new portfolio 6 or 9, or the full requirements. So those are our options, but what is that 5 years going to cost us? And what I mean by that, everything is being compared against the long-term partnership agreement, right? If you did nothing else and you said, I'm done with the exploratory process, I want savings today, I'm going to sign that LTPA amendment, we're going to just go ahead and start saving money today. What is that worth? In other words, what is that worth over that 5-year period? So we're going to bake that into this analysis as well, and basically take our RFP from a 20-year analysis that started in 2028 through 2047. We're just going to tack on the 5 years, right? What happens from 2023 to 2027. So we'll get to that a little bit later. And then, as I mentioned, we'll also jump into the sensitivity analysis at the end. So there's something, this is never a lot of fun, I'm not sure how many folks in the audience are familiar with the idea of real dollars versus nominal dollars. In my world, in an engineering world, we talk about this all the time. The federal government uses real dollars to show projections of information. All real dollars means is I take a base year and then I don't account for inflation. That's all it means. Nominal dollars means I'm talking about the dollars that I'm spending in the year that I spend them. I go to the grocery store. They say it's $100. I give them $100. I go to the grocery store next year. Maybe it's $105 for those same groceries because of inflation. I still give them $105. That's nominal dollars. Real dollars means, well, next year it's only $100 for the same set of goods because there's no inflation. So, in case you're curious, this is done in the industry all the time. People will use real dollars, which is what the IRP did. The IRP used 2018 real dollars. All that means is they didn't account for inflation. The RFP process, we did account for inflation. That's the only difference. I don't want anybody to get confused by this, and I do want to keep it simple, but the reason I'm bringing this up is because the information that was presented back in July and August of 2020 at the conclusion of the IRP talked about rates in real dollars. And what we've done in our process is converted all of that into nominal dollars. There's no difference, it doesn't change the results, it just takes it into accounting for inflation. So that's what we've done in the RFP process, and we did it for a couple of reasons. One was, I think everybody understands nominal dollars. It's a simple thing, right? I'm paying for what I have to pay for. You know, my grandfather used to tell me that a bottle of Coke cost 10 cents 50 years ago. Well, I can't pay 10 cents and get a bottle of Coke today, right? I gotta pay $1.39, whatever it is. So, you know, we did that because the proposals that we received in the RFP from all these different vendors talked about different escalations, right? They're going, hey, I'm gonna escalate the cost of your solar power by 2.5% a year, or I'm gonna escalate the cost of your thermal O&M cost by the consumer pricing index. Like they took different routes and different approaches. We're like, okay, well, we want to make that into our analysis. We want to understand what it means to use these different types of assumptions. And then we did use the inflation rate that the IRP had been based on, which was 2.1%. So all we've done is adjusted the TVA Portfolio 6 and Portfolio 9 that was in the IRP, originally at $69.05, $59. All we did was added inflation. That now, of course, moves it up to the nominal dollar basis. So that's going to be our ground floor, the $80.85, the $70. That's going to be our ground floor for what we start to build and compare the results of the RFP to. It's a little tricky, Richard. So this first one, TVA. So the IRP, at the end of the day, when we converted nominal dollars, said, look, your expected cost over 25 years in a $1 per megawatt hour basis, which is a rate terminology that we use in our industry all the time, dollars per megawatt hour, is $80.85. So again, we looked at the model that the IRP used to project TVA's cost. We updated it with publicly available information, and that resulted in a reduction of 50 cents a megawatt hour. It's a small adjustment in the scheme of things. It has to do with outlooks for renewable resources and other things. The other thing we did was we also factored in the fact that the LTPA would allow Mlgw to purchase up to 5% of its energy, and we assume from renewable resources, similar to what we were thinking about doing here with this local solar, 1,000 megawatts of local solar. So when we looked at the proposals that we got for local solar, and we looked at the cost of those, and that's about 200 megawatts of local solar resources that we could deploy. That would reduce our cost under the TVA LTPA by another $1.57. So those two things blended together now means our projection of TVA's cost under the LTPA would be $78.77 a megawatt hour. So that's our baseline that we're going to be comparing our analysis and our savings to. So the first portfolio, Portfolio 6, That had a slightly different combination of thermal generation resources, a little bit less solar renewable resources than Portfolio 9. But we'll look at this one first. The IRP in nominal dollars, $70.70. When we look at the results of the RFPs that we received for the renewable resources, the thermal generation, and the combination of transmission things that my colleague Seth Brown discussed, this is how things change relative to what the IRP assumptions were. So you can see a little bit of a cost reduction for the renewable resources, right? The RFP just simply said, hey, we think we can deliver a little bit more and a little bit less than what the IRP assumed. So you see a lower cost. Thermal generation, a little bit higher cost for the related resources, the combined cycle and the CTs that we talked about installing. And then finally, and my colleague Seth Brown went into a great bit of detail about this, the transmission. So this is the one, of course, you can see that is increasing the overall cost the most relative to the new information from the RFPs relative to the IRP assumptions that were done several years ago. So when you stack all those up, what we're now concluding is that the cost of Portfolio 6 is going to be $76.86 megawatt hour, dollars per megawatt hour. We're going to talk about dollars later on. This is Portfolio 9, the same approach, starting with what the IRP rate was going to be in nominal dollars, that's $69.59. We looked at the results of the renewable RFP, baked that in, the thermal generation, a little bit lower cost for renewables, a little bit higher cost for thermal generation, then of course transmission. That's $5.07 there, right? That's just, right, that's going from $700 million of expected transmission costs to $1.2 billion. That's why you're seeing that jump, about $5 a megawatt hour. So that lends itself to a resulting cost for Portfolio 9 at $74.66, right? This is forming kind of our new baseline for comparing to TVA and to the LTPA. So as I mentioned earlier, we did have some full requirements proposals. And we did want to make a comparison of the full requirements and then kind of blend in Portfolio's updated portfolio cost for 6 and 9. And then of course compare that to our new adjusted, revised, updated cost for the TVA LTPA. So this chart just kind of brings it all together in dollars per megawatt hour. So the full requirements proposal, what's interesting, right, is Portfolio 6 and 9 are made up of a lot of different things, right? A lot of different bidders, a lot of competitive information. We basically took the best of the best, blended them together versus the best full requirements proposal said, look, I'm going to come in and replace TVA. This is how I'm going to do it. This is how much it's going to cost to do it. And so with this one particular proposal, my colleague Seth Brown mentioned this earlier, they also had an alternative approach for the transmission that was going to be interconnected to MISO. So we baked their proposal in as well and reflected their cost. And that's how we're coming up with this gold yellow bar here on the far right, the $78.20 a megawatt hour. So, you can see how that compares to all of the other alternatives, right? 6, 9, and then of course the LTPA. This is an interesting effort, right? I mean, to go from TVA to another full requirements provider. Like I said, remember I mentioned earlier, very few entities in the country can even do this and pull this off. So it would be a big undertaking. There would have to be a lot of information fleshed out, a lot of details worked through. But when we take the best of the best for Portfolio 6 and 9, which include multiple bidders, multiple folks, this is the results we come up with. I'm not surprised by this because you're basically looking at a combination of slightly lower costs from other folks that are highly qualified to do this relative to one entity saying, I'm going to take all the risk to replace TVA. It's a lot of risk to assume. So you also, what I'm indirectly saying, there's also some qualitative benefits that come with Portfolio 6 and 9, including controlling your destiny because you own your transmission, diversity of resources and suppliers, and slightly lower cost. So it's kind kind of the best of all worlds. So now we're going to put this in dollars, because I imagine that's a little bit easier to relate to than me talking about dollars per megawatt hour. So take an approach that was similar to what was done in the IRP. We're talking about annual cost. So think about this as the average cost over this 20-year window, right? The RFP was basically evaluating a 20-year planning horizon from 2028 to 2047. So what you see now is kind of like an annualized version of that cost over that 20-year window. So again, I'm starting with the TVA LTPA, projected over that 20-year window is $1.06 billion, right? That's just what you'd expect to pay based on all the assumptions, all the information that we have available to us. Compare that to portfolio 9 and 6, and as I mentioned earlier, right, we were projecting slightly lower average cost. Well, that turns into savings, right? So portfolio 9, $55.3 million a year on average, and portfolio 6, $25.7 million per year on average. And again, based on all the assumptions that were originally provided in the IRP for certain things, natural gas prices, capacity prices, interest rates, and then layering in the results of the RFP, right? What people have told us, right? Real world information. This is what we will sell you solar power for, or thermal generation, or the cost to build the transmission. So this is the final result, but that's not it. As you may recall when I was walking us through the path, there is this 5-year window from 2023 to 2027 where if we were to give notice to TVA, it's a 5-year termination notice. So comparing to the LTPA would mean that there are some benefits that could be accrued in that 5-year window versus waiting 5 years to get the portfolio to 6 and 9. So we're going to talk a little bit about that as well. So this is just a slide, a transition slide to just kind of summarize, you know, what are our options? What are Mlgw's options today, right? You can continue on the same path that you're on, which is just stay with TVA under the current agreement. It does, as I mentioned at the outset of this presentation, this discussion, it does come with, you know, some benefits. The biggest one is that 5-year termination notice, no stranded cost, and the ability to preserve your options down the road. Remember, you sign an LTPA, what you've done is committed to now having to get a 20-year notice and picking up a big check for stranded cost. So preserving our optionality is the key benefit that we have today. But it also means we're paying a little bit more than we could under the LTPA. And again, if we gave that notice, we'd be under our current arrangement for the next 5 years versus if we wanted to jump over and give up and jump into the LTPA. So what is that worth over that 5-year period? So this is just simply demonstrating what the benefits are, financial benefits, of the LTPA relative to our current agreement in 2023 through 2027. And the benefits are that rate, that 3.1% base rate reduction, as well as that 5% carve out, the ability to bring in some renewable resources at a lower cost. You add all that up, it's about $170 million. So it's not insignificant. So what we wanted to do was reflect that because it is a part of now a 25-year analysis, right? The RFP was looking at 2028 because that's when folks could build and bring all this stuff online. But now we have this first 5 years between today, right, given a notice, and 2028 when we start seeing the benefits. And this is how the savings change because now we're just reflecting higher power costs for 5 years until we get to those savings starting in 2028. So just a simple adjustment to the numbers I showed you previously when you look at it over a 25-year period instead of a 20-year period. So portfolio 9 goes from $55 million a year in annual savings over a 20-year period. It's reduced down to $31 million a year over a 25-year period. And then portfolio 6 reduced from $25 million a year down to $9 million a year. Again, going from a 20-year period now across a 25-year period. So this is, we want to kind of present the totality of the decision, right? It's a big decision to make to start with. And remember, once you make it, you can't unmake it, right? Nobody's going to leave TVA and then decide later on they're going to come back to TVA. That's not the way it works. So if you're going to be thinking about something of this magnitude, right, a decision that in present day dollars over a 25-year period, right, is getting close to $20 billion, right? In other words, today dollars, right? It's a big decision. I know I haven't made a decision like that in my lifetime. So there's a lot of weight and gravity that comes to jumping into something like this. So we wanted to make sure everybody on the council, on the board understood that, you know, we've taken a 25-year approach because that makes the most sense to us. And we want you to be informed about what that means. So I know I've been saying this and I've been quite redundant about it, but you know, all of that information, right, is what we refer to as the PACE case, right? It used a combination of assumptions carried over from the IRP, blended in with the RFP. We thought it was prudent to take a look at those assumptions in light of the current environment we find ourselves and just adjust a few things to see what's the impact on our savings. You know, for better or worse, you want to know how those savings could fluctuate or change, because who knows, maybe interest rates for financing transmission facilities won't be 3.5%. Maybe natural gas prices won't be $4. You know, what happens if there is something different, and then what does it do to our savings? So I'm just going to mention this briefly. I think I said this earlier in the presentation. So what is a sensitivity analysis? It's nothing more than determining how sensitive your outcomes are based on certain assumptions. So what we did was we ended up looking at different assumptions for the price of natural gas, different meaning different than what the IRP assumed. So we looked at a different natural gas price. The IRP had assumed an average of around $5 over a 15-year window. We said, well, what happens if that bumps up to about $7.5 in MBTU, roughly a 50% increase. And by the way, that 755 assumption is lower than where gas prices are right now. Not suggesting they're going to stay there. Capacity price. The IRP assumed that capacity would be less than $5 a kilowatt a month because it assumed there'd be surplus capacity available. Not a terribly bad assumption, certainly not at the time. So we said, okay, well, what happens if that's not the case? What happens if there's not surplus capacity available? So we increased that a little over 50% to be more closely in line with what you could expect to pay for generation if you were having to pay for newer generation as opposed to older generation in a surplus market. And then finally, the interest rate, you know, bond financing is similar to home mortgages, right? You go to refinance, you're at the whim of the market. Can't control that any more than anything else. I certainly can't. But bond financing doesn't work any differently. I mean, if anybody follows government T-notes and bonds, right? Those things fluctuate daily, rapidly. And what we're seeing now is, right, is higher interest rates. So what we assumed is just a slightly higher interest rate at 4.5% to finance the transmission facilities that would be necessary to integrate Mlgw into MISO, as well as upgrade some of the local facilities. So the results of that sensitivity analysis are shown here, and I want to walk you through exactly what these charts represent. First thing, in the sensitivity analysis, we did everything in isolation. And all that means is we changed one variable at a time. We didn't change multiple variables. We just wanted to isolate and think about an environment where there's higher gas prices. Well, what does that mean? Well, TVA is going to have higher costs, right? They have exposure to natural gas. They're not immune. They have a very diversified system, but it does rely, a portion of it, on natural gas. Portfolios 6 and 9 obviously rely more on natural gas than TVA does. That's just the way the TVA system is built, right? Nuclear, hydro generation, coal, none of those things are related to natural gas. And if you look at TVA lately, they're on a quest to build out an enormous amount of solar resources over the next 10 years. So those things factor into why when we look at a high gas price, and this is what the gold bar and the blue bar are showing here, is now the savings under Portfolio 6 and Portfolio 9 relative to the base case. What I just talked about for that 20-year period, right? 25 million, 55 million, that was our base case. So now when I change the gas price and only the gas price and I increase it, what I see now is Portfolio 6, because of its additional reliance on natural gas, now shows a loss of $45 million a year. No savings, it's all gone. Portfolio 9, on the other hand, is a little bit more resilient because it actually is utilizing more renewable generation, right? Not gas-fired generation relative to Portfolio 6. But it's still not as diversified as the TVA system is today. So in that case, those savings drop from $55 million a year down to $40 million a year. So the next item that we adjusted in isolation was a higher capacity price. And that's only because Mlgw, in the IRP assumptions, in the RFP analysis, has to buy a certain portion of its capacity to serve its total load. And we had made assumptions, the IRP made assumptions about what that capacity would cost. So you are building and investing and procuring, and this is what the RFP did, a certain amount of capacity to serve your load. But what's not being done is a certain other portion of your capacity to serve your peak demand in the summer would have to come from another third party. And so we just fluctuated that price to see what impact that would have. In this case, Portfolio 6 goes from $25 million of savings, drops down to a loss. You're losing money, $38 million. Portfolio 9, on the other hand, still shows a savings. It's just now been reduced from $55 million down to roughly $10 million a year. Portfolio 9 has a little bit more generation that would be procured, a little bit more solar. So that's why it's a little bit more resilient relative to Portfolio 6. And then finally, the higher interest rate. Again, we didn't try to even guesstimate what higher interest rates would mean to underlying thermal generation PPAs, solar PPAs, right? The cost of acquiring and what those folks have to do to finance their own investments in those types of resources. All we looked at, what happens to Mlgw if their bond rate, that they would issue bonds to procure the funds to build the transmission facilities, the $1.2 billion. And if that interest rate increases by 1% over the IRP assumption of 3.5%, then your savings are reduced for both Portfolios 6 and 9 about the same amount, about $9 million a year. So 25 down to 16 or 55 down to 46 million. So again, just an observation about how each of those things in isolation could impact. Now, you know, and this is why I spent a lot of time at the beginning of this presentation going, wow, what has changed? I mean, think about it. Did anybody think we were going to be here a year ago? Was anybody going, oh yeah, I know mortgage rates are going to be up. I know the price of gasoline is going to be outrageous. Did anybody think that? Well, that's the joy of working in the electric utility business. You don't know what's coming, so what do you try to do? You try to stay diversified. I think about my pension or my 401k, right? I don't know that Tesla is going to be a rock star, company in 5 years. I don't go buy a lot of Tesla stock, right? I diversify. Well, electric utilities have to do the same thing, or else, this is an example of what happens, right? Exposure, risk, issues, these are what electric utilities live with every day. And by the way, right, they can't control these risks much better than anybody else. If they could, it would be very, very wealthy people. Now, I mentioned earlier we did this in isolation. So what's, just to kind of bring it all together, right? If you were just to blend these things and say, oh, higher interest rates, you mean like what we're living in today? Slightly higher interest rates than it was 2 years ago. Slightly higher gas prices, much higher than they were 2 years ago. Slightly higher capacity prices. You bring all that together, instead of these numbers you see here, Portfolio 6 would lose $100 million a year relative to TVA. Excuse me, Portfolio 9, you lose about $25 million a year relative to TVA, if all those things come together. So we try to treat it in isolation, just picking one thing at a time and going, hey, it's a sensitivity. Look at this, look at that. But then what happens? You blend some more than one, and it can change on you quickly. I will say this, right after I have some water. If the IRP had been conducted today, there's a good chance they probably would have developed slightly different portfolios. And that's only because they said, well, gas prices are not going to be $3, they're going to be $7, right? PPAs for solar may not be that. They would have taken different approaches to determine different outcomes. But again, you work in the environment you're in, and this is why folks do IRPs every 3 to 5 years, is because of this very thing. You cannot sustain a utility, electric utility, heck, any business for that matter, right? If you are not thinking about the future and thinking about how it's going to change, we live in a world of change. So, I've got to pause right there. This is just, again, just a reminder about how the world can change. I'm not trying to be a harbinger of doom and suggest that it will be like this in 2028, but I want the board and the city council to be mindful that it could be like this in 2028. I'm going to close out with just 2 slides on non-financial risk. So why am I talking about this? This isn't something that, the IRP or the RFP for that matter can go measure and assess. What are non-financial risks? The easiest way I like to phrase it is they are items and issues that can be well controlled, that can have severe financial consequences, right? They can be, you can think of like black swan events. I think about the issues that drove the stock market and the economy to crash in 2008, 2009, right? Who saw Lehman Brothers going underwater and all of those other major firms taking huge hits, right? Overnight, companies like GM were all of a sudden worth nothing, and we're going to the federal government asking for bailouts, right? Huge events that can't be predicted. If they could be predicted, GM wouldn't have had a problem to start with. Who predicted COVID? Who predicted supply constraint logistics? I'm hearing stories now about people buying cars that don't have chips in there to run things like backup cameras. People are buying a car that doesn't have a full feature in it, more than one actually, because they can't get the chips. I don't want to be a car manager, but what the heck? Are they not smart enough to see this coming? What's their problem? Why didn't they diversify? Why didn't they make more chips in the US? I don't know what the issues are. But they are suffering because of that. They're suffering, we're suffering. I want my car to have a backup camera, I'm just saying. So when I put these things up here, I want you to be mindful that, yeah, people go, oh, I can insure against that risk. No, you can't, because you don't even know what you need to insure against. If we all had this kind of foresight, nobody would be in this room, we'd be off in the South Pacific on our own island. So this is the world we live in. These are the things. I'll go over a few of these real quickly. Siting and permitting risk. Really all we're thinking about, look, if Mlgw is going to build transmission lines, every transmission company in the world has this risk, right? Everybody heard of NIMBY? Not in my backyard? I mean, does anybody want a transmission line in their backyard? I don't. And guess what? People get opposed to that. But there's other risks, right? There are environmental issues, there's regulatory issues, there's just getting approval from some authority or some agency that I can't control as much as I'd like to. There's credit rating risk, and this specifically applies to Mlgw. And that's only because they had been told, and this is not uncommon, by S&P and Moody's, that if you switch suppliers, if you leave TVA, guess what? you're going to be on watch for downgrade. What does that mean? And by the way, I've heard this from other folks who've done the same thing. What's a downgrade risk mean? I can tell you what it means. It means you go from investment grade to something less than investment grade, and everybody says, well, you're risky. When I now agree to lend bonds, I'm basically going to have to charge you a higher interest rate. That's the way the world works. So the regulatory risk, the labor market, right? Who knows when there's going to be labor shortages? These are all things that you have to think about. And we don't want you to not think about them. And not that I can easily quantify them. I can tell you what they look like after they've happened. Construction risk, right? If I'm going to build power plants and solar facilities, everybody endures these things. Just ask a solar developer if they were expecting the U.S. Department of Commerce to come blazing in there and tell them that they were at risk for violating tariffs. Basically, China working through Southeastern companies to sell parts so that they can sell them to the U.S. It's, it's supply chain logistics. Anybody trying to renovate or build a house? Anybody on budget, on time? Anybody? I mean, I know it was bad when you were doing this 5 years ago and you go, oh, I'm 10% over budget. Yeah, that would be a blessing these days. Or if it was going to happen within 3 months. My point is this. It affects everything. We live with it in our daily lives. Electric utilities like Mlgw take on this preponderance of risk. Under your current situation with TVA, most of these things you don't even think about. Just, it's an afterthought. Why? Why? Because TVA's got thousands of employees that are trying to deal with this, a diversified portfolio, an institution and a framework that is built around managing this. I'm not suggesting Mlgw can't build out that infrastructure, but it's not cheap, it's not easy, and you don't do it overnight. So again, think about those risks. Again, we didn't try to put dollar value to that. Counterparty credit risk, I mean, who's expecting companies overnight to go bankrupt? Nobody. And when you see it coming, it's usually too late to do anything about it. But we want you all to be mindful of that. Again, it's just not a simple thing to ignore when you're talking about billions of dollars on the line at stake. So with that, y'all are probably done listening to me anyway. I am going to turn it over to President Young and let him have a few comments.
Thanks, Chris. Appreciate that. And a lot of information. I want to try to close out before we get to the Q&A part, illuminating some of the next steps. Some of the next steps. And part of what we need to consider here from some of the timing, obviously today's presentation for everyone here is going to be uploaded to the website. It may already be on the website, but certainly by the end of today, so this information will be out there. The questions and answers, the things that are being asked today, and there may be some subsequent ones, but those will be posted beginning next Friday, so as the answers are developed, because some of the questions may require answers that need some research, so we may need some time to get all those questions completed, answers completed. Our goal is to have everything that's brought forth today out there and available by within the next 30 days. The comments from the public, so this is really important to understand. This is really our first foray into providing information to the public, to our board and to the council, of course, regarding where we are. But obviously there will be opportunities going forward, and we've delineated 3 of the next Mlgw board meetings, certainly for public questions or inputs that some people may not be able to get access to the online portal. They may want to, we obviously have board meetings, those are public, folks can certainly come. We are just targeting these 3 dates because of the remainder of the schedule that you'll see here in a moment. So after this today, GDS will be in the process of finalizing and conducting negotiations with a short list of bidders. That is what was in their proposal, and that is just, and again, I want to commend and thank Chris and Seth and GDS. They are right on schedule, pretty much, with what was in the proposal that was approved last year by our board and the council, and so we really appreciate them sticking to that schedule. It is a plan right now, again, the word, pay attention to that word tentative up there, it's important. But the plan right now is that we will bring a power supply recommendation to our board at the August 17th meeting, which is the second board meeting in August. that recommendation will be taken into account information gathered to this point, or to that point after those 3 remaining next board meetings, as well as the information you've heard today. And there have been a lot of questions about bids and the availability of bids, being able to review bids and all of that. And again, you heard Chris, I think, talk about all the bids that we received. Absolutely, when we bring a recommendation to our board, it is typical that at that time, bids are made public, and it is our intention to make sure that that happens by that August date. So hopefully you see that. Following that, then on the 17th, we would still like to have some additional time for public input, right, or public questions. So there would be at least another 30 days, roughly, before we would ask our board to come to a decision on the move forward at the second board meeting in September. And so that's sort of a tentative schedule for those of you who are wondering what the next few weeks would look like. Just a reminder, under this current arrangement, the finalization of any contract, the current arrangement we have with GDS, final arrangement of any contract negotiations and subsequent approval. So the proposal that GDS put forward baked in that after this checkpoint right here where we are, and then following the short list of bidders, and then following the recommendation to the board, the remaining months of this year would be utilized to do any contract negotiations and et cetera that would be necessary, with an objective of having in January 2023, having something formally in place by January of 2023. So again, this is still in line with that. One more thing I want to mention before we go to questions, I just want to say, because I forget it if we don't. I do want to thank a couple of other people that are here. Frank Fletcher, who's sitting up here, has been the project manager on this at Mlgw. Frank's been a relatively behind the scenes but incredibly important aspect to this process. He has worked tirelessly, hours and hours, coordinating a lot of information. I want to thank Frank. Alonzo Weaver and Dana Jeans, from an executive perspective. Alonzo has really been tasked with being the executive sponsor for the last several years on this, and Dana's been assisting with his staff, and I think Rod Fleek is here. Their team has been involved in providing a lot of the financial information. So with that, and I know there are some questions from those of you on the board and the council, and I'm going to, Chris and Seth, of course, are here to respond to those. So I'm going to transition us to that phase right now. So, ready to go.
Thank you, President.
Yes, Ms. Robertson.
Thank you. I have 3 questions, and I don't know if you can answer them, or we may need the attorney and president, everybody. Number 1, what is our current business model? And if we were to change, do we have to change our business model? Are we just doing transmission now, and then we will be doing transmission and whatever else, and how does that affect who we are and what we do moving forward? That's number 1. Number 2, as we look at our investments into the future, did we consider the cost to do business moving forward? New staff, new skill sets, what we need as a company to make sure that our employees are paid properly, the cost of living increases, all those things are not in this proposal. However, it will impact our numbers going down the line. And my 3rd question is, based on the information that we received today, I wanted to just state before I ask this question that I thought your presentation, Chris and Seth, was clear, understandable, and thank you for walking us down the pathway that I thought we needed to, especially when we started out with definitions and making sure that people understand where we are. But in communicating this to the community, have you reduced it down to a language or a picture or a cartoon of where we're going? Because this is a lot of information, and the public's not going to listen to 3 or 4 hours of this. We've got to be able to share this in a manner that the community can understand. Thank you. Got all 3 questions?
I'm glad we started off with the simple questions first. So I'll start off by saying I'm not sure I'm qualified to answer all of the questions, or at least the fullness and type of informative robustness that they require. I can speak high level, and I'm happy to open the floor to other Mlgw folks as well. I'm going to just start with the first one, and I'm not even sure I'm the qualified one to answer this, but what I can say is, today, the business model, and I think everybody's aware of this, right? You're managing your transmission, your distribution system. TVA is the complete package in terms of power supply. So, right, you've got the staff that is set up to manage that business model as it sits today. One of the things that we did do in the IRP, and I'm going to tap a little bit in your second question, but not intentionally, is the IRP and then subsequently the RFP did factor in some additional cost to transition to a little bit of a different business model, meaning more transmission investment, more requirements to manage those resources. But I would suggest that it's probably not enough, and it would probably need to be reviewed more intensely and with more detail. But I'm going to stop right there on this first question and allow others.
And I just echo that. I think clearly there would need to be some changes. One of the things that we all need to consider is that in our current business model, based on what Chris said, what we don't do, you heard and saw the scenario with regards to interconnection with MISO, managing that and the additional operational aspects of, even if we're not the owner of a generating facility, for example, we still have some issues that we would have to take on that we currently don't take on. So it's my suspicion, we haven't run the final numbers on this, that's part of what we got to do over the next few weeks, is that there would be some staff impacts to having to make sure we would be prepared to handle that. So our business model would certainly shift to some degree under another scenario. Anything that we do differently, where from a planning, again, we don't, all that stuff for system planning and all that, we don't do any of that today. We're going to have to get into that business more than likely in some form under a new arrangement.
While you're answering that question, those skill sets cost more money, and our citizens want us to pay less money. Okay? Can you share about those skill sets and what they cost realistically?
I'm gonna be like Chris. I don't know. The weather person can predict the future, and they don't have to be right. So I hope I don't have to be right either. But the cost for those skill sets today are certainly probably more than they were last year, and my suspicion is they'll be more next year. So skill sets that we don't currently have in our operation that we would need to acquire, and it's a competitive market today to get those skill sets. So we have to figure out how to make sure that happens. But I will just say, just to kind of balance all that, in comparison to the significant cost you've seen so far today, it's not as, I wouldn't call it a material, I would say that it's going to shift it either way, because when you look at the hundreds of millions and billions of dollars today, I think the cost for us on the staff side would certainly not be in that ballpark. It's going to be more, and we're going to have to acquire probably even new organizational structure, but still more to come on that, and we'll be figuring that out over the next few weeks. Communication, the question, so the third question. I wish anybody the best to be able to distill this down to something really, really simple. I've been in this industry for 40 years. I'm telling you, it is what it is to some degree. There are some analogies. You heard Chris share some analogies. There are some analogies that we're going to try to make into this case, but some of it kind of just is what it is. I'm not sure how to make it much simpler. We try to share with people the importance of distinctions between outside the park, inside the park. When you saw, one of the things I do want to make sure you understand or recall, the additional incremental transmission costs that 161, the things that have to be done that added to what was in the integrated resource plan, are inside Shelby County transmission issues that we have to deal with if we transition. Getting transmission lines to us, those 3 lines that you saw, is separate and apart from that. So we would, you know, but we try to help people, but it's confusing because transmission is transmission. Well, there's transmission getting here and there's transmission in here. So I know that's confusing, but we absolutely have some challenges with making it simple. We're going to work as hard as we can to make it easy to understand as best we can, because we do want everybody to have a good awareness of what we're talking about. Thank you for that, Doug, for the question. Who's next?
I have a couple of questions. So I'm trying to reconcile the numbers that we're talking about. So for us to have a number in the public domain of how much this undertaking would cost, is that $1.2 billion?
For transmission facilities.
So that's just, so what, is there a number, so what's the number for any type of generation that we would have, the investment for generation that we have?
So unlike the transmission approach where we would, on the generation side as well as the renewable side, the assumption there was that we would do a purchase power agreement, meaning you would allow a third party to come in and build it, and then you would in essence be renting it from them. Now, there's pros and cons to that, right? It's just like building a home and having a contractor build a home, and then you either move in and you own it because you financed it and you take care of all the maintenance, or you rent it and you foist that on the landlord. In this case, the reason we took the PPA approach is because you're talking about billions of dollars of generation and billions of dollars of solar investment. Specifically with solar, I don't want to go down this rabbit hole too far, but because of the way the federal government set up some benefits on investment tax credits, those only flow to non-public entities. So for example, Mlgw can't take advantage of it. You can't go build a solar field and take advantage of ITCs, but because the third party can, they can give you a much lower cost, and it's actually more effective and cheaper for you to do that as opposed to building your own solar. With the case with the thermal generation, we specifically thought about this and foisting billions of dollars on Mlgw's balance sheet. It's difficult to do, but if a third party, and there's lots of them, are willing to build that generation, manage it, maintain it, operate it, all things that Mlgw doesn't do today, based on your business model question, nor does Mlgw have to hire the staff and take on the risk directly. So, transmission, you're going to own that, continue to do what you do, you're going to finance it. The generation, you would just do a purchase power arrangement, so it's not like it's billions of dollars, but it's not like billions of dollars you have to pay to finance today.
Okay, so, Mr. Jennings, a question for you. How much are we carrying on our books right now when it comes to debt?
So the electric division, I believe, has about 300 million.
So 300 million. So we're talking about the electric division taking on 4 times additional debt versus what we have right now. So, but one thing I think we need to understand is that the debt service is built into what our electric rates are.
Correct.
And so the other part of that is that if we take on 4 times additional debt, that's got to be paid by somebody. And that somebody would be the ratepayers of Mlgw. So what part of this, what Ms. Robinson, what I think would be a key part of it, if some way it could be distilled down to essentially say, if we did this, this is how much more would be added to your utility bill.
And the cost of the debt related to the transmission was built into the numbers that Chris showed, so it's included in that.
So, Chris, so talking about though, if we have an outside entity to build the generation, they could, would those be for-profit organizations or would they be non-profit organizations? So we would be putting our, we may have a nice agreement in place for 20 years. And then the fate of our ratepayers would be tied to the profitability the quarterly earnings expectations for for-profit organizations after that certain period of time. Okay.
That is true, right? At the end of every contract, this is the way these things work, right? You take a risk about what the future is going to hold for you. A lot of times, right, you try to anticipate, prepare, manage, plan accordingly. For example, specifically with that one, it is a risk, right? It could drop off. They may have other plans. They may just say, oh, we're going to start to sell into the MISO market. We no longer want to sell it to you. That would be mitigated and offset through contract negotiations where you say, hey, we want an option at the end of year 17 to do something differently or have a buyout provision. So you can manage that, but you're right, it's another one of those risks that you face that you can't exactly put a dollar value on today.
Thank you.
Chris, I've got a couple of questions. In JT's slide, it mentioned you still got some negotiating to do in the next few weeks. Is that also on the LTPA agreement? Do you feel like there's negotiating room in there?
No, sir. We have, just to be clear, we have not negotiated. We, GES and Mlgw, have not negotiated with TVA on any of that. And I would just say this: my understanding is the LTPA is non-negotiable.
Gotcha. Very good. Second question, and you may not be able to answer this. This falls into the unknown risk category. And we've heard, again, through a lot of the press, that some of our surrounding communities, Germantown, Arlington, Millington, whatever we decide, there's an option, they could go direct to TVA. How much of a reality is that, and what would it take for something like that?
I appreciate these questions. I think the reality is we probably have to ask them what their concerns would be, how we could address those concerns. But at the end of the day, if they can physically manage and maintain their relationship with TVA and not Mlgw, then you're right, all bets are off, and they can decide to leave. And right, that's just a loss of load and ability to spread our costs, certainly our fixed cost over a wider load. Not sure about all the direct correlations and impacts, but it'd probably be negative if I just had to guess out loud.
Good morning. I'm Cheryl Patterson, General Counsel at Mlgw. Without being able to answer specifically, everybody should understand that those communities in their franchise agreements with us do have the option to do something different. There's a process. It may be expensive for them, so I can't answer specifically your question, but it is something that we'll need to have conversations with them about.
Thank you. And my last question, I know we get worried that we're going potentially into a 20-year agreement with TVA. All these other agreements are going to be 20 plus years as well, aren't they?
Yeah, that's a fair question. So, if you were to do anything differently with TVA, right, it's a 20 plus year arrangement. However, in the RFP process, we were actually, we asked for folks to give us like a minimum term of 15 years for solar, for example. But folks gave us solar proposals up to 30 years. Different costs, different conditions. Same thing with the thermal generation. We asked for a minimum of 20 years. We did receive thermal generation offers for 25 and 30 years. So the way we analyzed that was still on a 20-year basis, but it is possible to get arrangements that are a little bit longer than 20 years.
I'm sure that's a function of their debt structure and returns.
That's exactly what it is.
Chris, thanks for making the case early on about the antitrust that TVA may or may not be involved in. I think you laid out a pretty good case of a non-negotiable 20-year agreement, and basically it's financially infeasible for many local power companies to leave, which I'm not an antitrust attorney, that's seemingly seems to fit in that wheelhouse, and other people challenge that. We keep talking about 2028 and beyond, but realistically speaking, I mean, that's just not even feasible, right? I think one of the issues that I keep running into is, we've been trying to develop one deal for 15 years and we're just now getting there, right? And that's a simple 5-acre project versus, you know, if you've ever seen anybody build a highway system out in the country for a Walmart to come sit down on, it takes 20 years and right away and research and eminent domain and legal cases. And I think it took Carol Coletta 2 years just to get the Corps of Engineers to bless that we weren't going to impact the Mississippi Railroad. So you're talking about dragging transmission lines on. So I guess let's talk about that. What are we keep using 5 years because that's the rolling agreement. But let's be honest, this is a 30 or 40-year process. Is that somewhat, in an order of magnitude, would that be accurate as a possibility that that length of time to actually bring this all to fruition?
So I'll address that. You know, with the power plants, a 5-year engineering, permitting, construction time is pretty reasonable. I mean, you know, supply chain issues notwithstanding. The issue is on the transmission, you know, $1.2 billion. You have 2 major river crossings over the Mississippi River. You're going to have to deal with, you know, a lot of engineering. You don't know what you're going to get into, you know, with siting and routing, environmental issues. And so on the transmission side, 5 years is really not a reasonable assumption. It would be more in a 7 to 8 year time frame to get all those facilities constructed. You're going to have some cooperation with TVA. You just can't, you know, on January 1st of 2028, unplug from TVA and plug into MISO. I mean, that's not practically the way it's going to be done. So for the transmission, 7 to 8 years is probably a more reasonable expectation.
God, I would love to see the federal government move that quickly. We spent a lot of time today talking about CapEx, right? The majority of this conversation is CapEx, 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 you know. But really, in addition to that, I can understand debt pretty easily. That's an area that I feel very comfortable in. What I want to know more about in detail, and we seemingly aren't going to get there, is the operational expense. We keep talking about the PPA, and I know it's N69, but you know, flexing what we're going to do in a fixed contract agreement in the spot market, and how all that's going to be handled. I mean, this is more tongue-in-cheek, but Mlgw would have to grow twice in size in order to handle that. And again, we're talking about the timeline of, well, there's savings down the road, and what we really haven't taken into account is when we would have to send that debt to the market, when we would have to start hiring those people, and then when you actually really begin to realize any sort of meaningful savings. So to both Councilman Jones and Councilwoman Robinson's point, you know, you have an extreme amount of front-end loaded costs that you've got to take on and figure out how to get the ball rolling before you even realize any meaningful savings, assuming they're there when we get to a 8, 9, 10 year period. I don't have a crystal ball, but I can't imagine that rates are coming back anytime soon. And I will say, I keep getting lectured by our general counsel, who's been around a few decades, that even though rates are going up, still historically they're still pretty low. If you bought a house in 80, 85, you're probably thinking to yourself, 5% ain't that bad. But I guess, and I'll transition this into a question. When you go and talk to Mlgw and make your recommendation, how detailed are you going to get? I would call today a pretty high level, distilled down, not very technical, you know, overview, which I think, to Councilwoman Robinson's point, there's huge public education that has to occur, especially mainly more for the council members. But what level of detail would you be getting in as that recommendation starts coming? Because there are a lot of moving pieces and nuances to what's going on. And for me, you know, I'll give you another specific example that I've got a question on. You know, if we finance and then take possession of the transmission line, who's responsible for the R&M on that on an ongoing basis, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's Mlgw's responsibility. They decide to own it. They have to operate and maintain it. And those costs were factored in, you know, the levelized cost figures that Chris showed you. You know, the $1.2 billion is the capital outlay, but then, you know, the debt service, the operations, maintenance expense, that's all worked into our pricing model.
Okay. Wait, you said it's worked into your pricing model?
I'm sorry?
You said it's worked into the pricing model?
Yes. in the levelized cost that Chris showed you for the portfolios,
Okay.
those O&M costs.
So that has the ongoing OpEx. All right. And then I've got two more questions, and I'll turn it over to the next person. One really is like a two-part for, obviously we've got bidder A through D in order to protect the integrity of the process. It sounds like it was more addressed, I guess, down in the financials about kind of scoring TVA. If you were to hypothetically score them against the full requirements, but I guess we saw that more in the savings comparison, I guess. Would you agree with that, or is there a way to score them as a bidder if they were, I mean, we already know what their process is.
Yeah, I was trying to make sure I heard your question. So yeah, if I was scoring TVA relative to some of those other guys, yeah, very much, right? They were going to score extremely high, right? Proven, capable, viable, creditworthy. They're doing it. They got a strong track record of performance. They would score very high, right? The only thing we'd be complaining about is just exactly how much the cost is.
Fair enough. And then to that point, we've got a projected renewables. Have we compared that with the new amendment in the TVA agreement as far as the, a potential amendment about what we could do? So the LTPA, we're being told is non-negotiable, which I'm hoping this favored nations clause gets struck down because, like the General Assembly, that specifically targeted us. Have we looked at any potential savings if we were able to negotiate a larger ability for renewables? Say, I think, what are we, 5% now? If we could move to 10% or 15% with them?
I like the way you're thinking. Unfortunately, no effort has been to, again, GDS and Mlgw have not actively engaged TVA to negotiate LTPA or any other benefits. Again, I am speaking out of turn in the sense that, like I said, I've not sat down with TVA. I have no idea. My understanding is that every other party, and there's been a large number of them that have signed the LTPA, it's basically you get what you get. And they're not, I'll say it this way, just thinking like a business person, why should TVA give one extra benefit to one party and then not give it to every other 150 wholesalers? That would be a problem.
And I have one last question.
So we are 10% of their.
Yeah.
Exactly.
That's right. So I have one last question. It has to do with your calcs, your assumptions on the discount and inflation rate. Inflation rate I can get typically close to 2-3% a year. That's, if we were doing a development model, we'd have OpEx going up for inflation and revenues going up for inflation, which is certainly something Mlgw would consider. But how did you determine the discount rate on the go forward, just where the typical borrowing, where our borrowing costs are, 350 basis points or?
That was it.
Okay.
What we did, very consistent with what the IRP did, which made that same assumption, right? Our bond, our carrying cost, about 3.5% at the time. We simply carry that forward as the discount rate to use in the analysis.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Chris.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Chris. Just a few questions that I wanted to try to clear up. So you were saying that for solar development, public entities don't get any federal discount. So I'm assuming that's the reason TVA is building gas plants instead of doing more solar. They're not getting those discounts?
So I don't want to speak specifically for TVA, but the way the ITC benefit works, I have to be a taxable entity. In other words, right?
So then
I can't offset taxes.
they're not taxable.
So that is correct. What I assume TVA is doing, again, a big assumption on my part, is that they are contracting to have third parties basically enter into a PPA with those parties so that they can take advantage of it.
And you're aware, I guess, of the judge's ruling based on current federal law that we can't use any TVA transmission lines if we switch over. Is that correct? That's got to do, that's that $1.2 billion that we're talking about now. So if the federal laws were to change, how would that change this dynamic?
Well, that's a very good question. So if Congress were to, take action and bring the fence down, we say, around TVA, theoretically, TVA, you could request them to wheel that power from MISO. However, they don't have that capacity now. There's not an extra 2,400 megawatts of import capacity that TVA has now between itself and Mlgw and MISO. So TVA would still have to, or Mlgw or third party would still have to build substantial transmission facility. 1.2 billion, I don't know. I don't know what the answer is.
So I'm just thinking, you know, like right now you said they have places where they share power back and forth. Would it not be advantageous for the federal power grid for us if we build out for TVA to stay connected with this system here and us not have to pay $57 million to disconnect? I mean, is that not something that should be considered if we're looking at a national level?
Well, Dr. Warren, I mean, we don't know what's going to happen with Congress. You know, that group.
No one does, but I mean, we need to like give Congress some options.
Right.
As we're looking at this to think, oh, well, there's not just us doing it one way. And based on what you're saying, you know, looking at the interest rate right now and the economy the way it is, it seems that moving very quickly on this may not be prudent, but getting our ducks in a row for a longer transition may be something that we should be doing as a system. That's why I'm asking this question. So the answer would be?
Well, I think the bigger question in my mind, having done this for so many years, the question is for TVA. TVA, why don't you integrate into MISO? And that way all those benefits would flow to all the local power companies, right? I mean, it would certainly, I would assume TVA has studied it. I'm sure they have. They got some pretty smart minds. I'm sure they've looked at maybe integrating with PJM or integrating with MISO, and then the LPCs, including Mlgw, could receive a lot of those benefits from economy purchases, renewables, or whatever that's in solar. That's really the question.
Was that sort of what President Trump was thinking about when he was thinking maybe we should disband in TVA?
Right.
He was looking at those sort of
No, TVA could still remain TVA, but they would integrate into the MISO market. They would take their transmission facilities and basically put them in control, and their generating facilities, put them under MISO's control, and it would be part of one big system. And so then, you know, there's economies of scale there. You know, it would enable TVA maybe to shut down some of their non-economical plants and enjoy some of these benefits that we've been talking about joining MISO.
And maybe get a little bit out of the coal, shut down some of the coal plants.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
And one thing to add to that, Councilman Warren, real quickly, just a reminder, and Chris, you may have said this earlier, but I want to just reiterate a distinction, and we've been talking about MISO a lot, and people talk about MISO and TVA, and I just want to reiterate that they're very, very different. MISO is a marketplace of utilities. So when you think about Entergy, when you saw on here that Entergy, the interconnection point, so Entergy is essentially like a TVA. Entergy is a utility, fully and vertically integrated utility. TVA is transmission and generation, but the MISO environment is a marketplace of utilities. So I think it's really important to know that distinction. Is back to just to your question, I just want to clarify that for folks to.
Yeah, I think, thank you very much, President Young. I think that's important because I don't think most people do understand that essentially, instead of having a number of entities that we could potentially be purchasing power from in MISO, we're with one entity. And I think Chris brought up very much in your first point, you know, 20-year contract, responsible for all of TVA's future obligations. How much would we be responsible for in that 20-year LTA for all of the toxins that are in the ground that TVA has responsibility for now? Are we 10% responsible?
You would be.
Okay, and if we're not in that long-term contract, if we're not in that long-term contract, we're not responsible. Is that
Correct. You're free and clear in your current contract.
right? Thank you very much.
I have an additional question based on what Dr. Warren just shared. 3 or 4 years ago, I visited where they purchased electricity from other agencies across the whatever section of the country that we're in, TVA. And the question that I asked was, how many times in the previous year did you purchase from MISO because their rates were lower than the other companies that you use? And they told me 3 days. So why would and this is just a question, if I want to use them to negotiate, just like on Wall Street, where I get my utilities from, why would I want to be connected to these other groups as well, so that I can get the lowest rate? Because evidently they don't have a lowest rate all the time. So wherever TVA is connected to, I need to be connected there as well if I'm going to need them. So is that considered in any of these scenarios?
So it's considered in a small part, and that is, if you're integrated into the MISO marketplace, the advantage that Mlgw has, as President Young said earlier, is access to a whole bunch of different utilities, multiple hundreds of utilities, market players, participants, generators. You would have numerous choices, and that is what, to a certain degree, this RFP process was reflecting, and that is folks that would be able to sell you power from solar resources in Arkansas and Mississippi. Those would be in MISO, but you would be allowed to access them as well as other generation sources from many, many different folks. So you would have the ability to do that and get the most competitive price in the market at that time.
So my concern is, if I can do it, why isn't TVA doing that now?
Well, let me just make a comment.
Help me understand.
Sure. So, I mean, we don't know exactly how TVA is transacting, but they are not integrated into the MISO marketplace. When they say they're getting power from MISO, that could mean that they're doing a bilateral deal with Entergy or with Arkansas Electric Cooperative. We don't know. They are not in MISO. Just the same as they can buy power and sell power to Southern Company because they have a border with them. They can buy and sell power with Duke because they have a border with them in North Carolina. They can buy and sell power with PJM because TVA is right in the middle of everything, so they can do, bilateral transactions with a bunch of folks, but that's not the same as putting your utility into MISO, like Entergy has done. So it's a whole different system.
Thank you. We probably need just a little more information about those integrations and how they actually work. We have an assumption, but we need to know how those integrations actually work. Thank you.
One thing I want to talk about is.
May I speak before you
Yes,
start?
please. I'm sorry.
Thank you. I'm sitting here listening to the remarks, the entire presentation. And my concern is this process as fair and as transparent as it needs to be? It appears to me that it's more leniency going towards TVA. So I have a question. In August, once you actually present what your recommendations are those individuals going to be able to make presentations to the general public to try to explain how they could justify coming up with alternatives to the current system that we have? That's my first question.
So justifying alternatives.
Explain their proposals to the general public. Share it.
I'm just trying to follow you. When you say
Okay.
alternatives, I'm thinking of the resource portfolios from the IRP.
Okay, you will select your top 3, 4, 5, whoever you select.
Yes, ma'am.
Will those individuals be allowed to present their proposals to the public?
I'm going to look for somebody from Mlgw.
So if the question is, will bidders be allowed to present their individual bids? So let me just back up a quick minute.
Yep.
The role that GDS had in this process was to aggregate the arrangements that would be beneficial to all customers. So if you have any individual bidder that may, and all the bids, just to be clear, as is the case when we do contracts, bids obviously will become public once we have an intent to award or recommendation. That does not mean there will be a final decision at that point. As you saw on there, there's still going to be time for comments and questions. And there will be time for anyone who wishes to review any of the bids in any level of detail they'd like to, and if there's a question about wanting to get a particular bidder to speak to any particular group, I think that's up to the group that's asking the question. So I don't think, but if you're because the challenge to your question, if I understand it correctly, what's being done here is to aggregate the arrangement to make a fair comparison. If you're talking about having 26, 500 many individual bidders to make a presentation, again, all that's incorporated, and if you want to validate what's in there in this information, it's all going to be available. That's what that mid-August date is. So I can't speak specifically to bidders can do whatever they wish once that's open. If they wish to tell the world what they bid and explain it, that's certainly up to them.
Okay, I'm only asking because today it appears as though we're already leaning in one direction, and I want to make certain that the other side is given the same opportunity. Now that brings me to my next question. You're going to provide this on August 17th. That's when the bids will be made open. At that time, I've requested that we get a consultant, and it's been approved by the city council. So my consultant is going to be able to come in on the 17th. And how much time do you think that consultant is going to need in order to go over everything that you've been going over for the last year, for 6 months?
Right.
You know, it's so time consuming if we can't get hold of the information. Meaning that I'm gonna look to have to make that decision. I need as much information as possible myself.
Sure.
I'm not an engineer. Right now, I don't know what direction to go other than listening to you. I got to lean over here for TVA because the cost is going to be too great for this city. But at the same time, I believe there are opportunities. You know, if we believe this, we wouldn't have cell phones today. If things could not change, it's not going to be easy. You know, and if TVA is such a public utility, why won't they work with us with those transmissions? You know, this process can be worked out. I just think that leaning one way or the other way is not the answer. We need to find a way to work together with TVA and with other possible sources. But what I'm getting is, come August, you're going to make a recommendation. I'm going to push my consultant in. They're going to have to take the time to read it all. Who knows how much time they need. Then rush back to me in September or October, share the information with the council, and we have to make a decision in 3 weeks about the, the future of electricity
So just to clarify,
for this city.
Yeah, just to clarify though, and I want to ask Chairman Graves to speak to that, there really is no time constraint regarding when a final decision has to be made. So there's nothing in this that says you absolutely have to make a decision by any date after the recommendation.
I thought I saw December.
That's in the proposal. That was the time frame projected in the proposal for negotiations to occur and get finalized to a contract. But if the board can decide to take 6 months or 6 years, for that matter, to evaluate this, so there's really no hard, fast time constraint in terms of a final decision. Those were just projected, and that's the word tentative that was on the top of that. But I'm going to ask Chairman Graves if you want to agree.
Yeah, what we are expecting sometime in August is for the executive team, along with GDS's recommendation as they finish finalizing these negotiations or finishing touches, to bring a solution to the Mlgw Board of Commissioners. At that point, as JT just said, there'll be at least a 30-day, probably longer, to get comfortable and make sure everybody understands all the components of this. Especially if if the proposed solutions to leave TVA, there are a lot of details in that. And so, again, I think August is a deadline that we had set a year ago as we started down this journey to have something back to us. And we set that because we believed that there were huge dollars at that time, $400 or $500 million a year, which this one proves out. That's not there. So it's, again, transparency critical, and this was the start of that. I do know, and I understand exactly what you're asking. The questions that have been asked today lend themselves towards, well, it sure does make potential sense to stay with TVA. That's always the easiest, most comfortable thing to do. And again, we wouldn't have gone down this path if we didn't really believe we needed to take a look at all options. TVA's been our supplier for 80-something years. If you don't do a price check, any business person, every few years you're probably not doing the right thing. So this has forced us to take a look at what we are paying today, what the alternatives are. I don't think we were there. That's what I asked earlier, starting the meeting this morning. Be curious, be open-minded. I know we had a lot of people externally that were trying to influence what everybody was thinking. We got to put that aside, take a look at what's best for the citizens and our customers. And so I'm sorry for a lot of the questions sounded more TVA leaning, but I think that was just the nature of how this presentation.
I mean, I respect the presentation, but I'm just telling you how I personally felt and when I was listening to it. And in regards to outside, that's the general public talking to us through these various agencies. So I think they come with a lot of merit, and that we need to keep that in mind. Again, this is probably one of the most important decisions, a vote that I will pass on the city council. And I don't want it to be done in a short period of time with very limited information. It was talked about how complex this whole setting was and why it would be difficult to lead the TVA setting. So I guess my other question is to the group. When you mentioned that you had an engineering firm with you, because you were the one, Chris, you were making that final decision. Have you ever worked in a setting where it was this complicated and you made a recommendation to leave the given arrangement?
I'm really glad you asked that question. So when I was a young man, a long time ago in the 90s, I had the good fortune of working with the only entity that left TVA. And it was because of the work we did at GDS that allowed Bristol, Virginia to walk away from TVA starting in 1996, 1997. In case anybody's familiar with Bristol, Virginia, they had a wonderful opportunity that we helped negotiate, we helped arrange for, led them to a successful transition for 7 glorious years. Then, remember that stuff I talked about?
Inflation.
Everything. The world changed. When that 7-year contract ended, and they had saved a lot of money relative to the TVA rates at the time, 2004 timeframe. You may be familiar back then, oil started escalating rapidly, natural gas prices, things outside of their control, the marketplace changed. Does anybody know where Bristol, Virginia is today? TVA. They came back. We helped them lead. We helped negotiate those complex situations. We gave them the objective, unbiased information in order to make a great decision. And they took it, and they left. Since that time, they managed to come back to TVA. So I'd like to think that what we did here today, and I'm speaking for GDS specifically, is we gave you unbiased, objective information. If I'm trying to lean you in a certain way, I apologize. My job is not to do that. You know why? I don't make the decision. I don't even have to live with the consequences. You do.
Exactly.
And I want you to be able to make the most informed decision that you can possibly make. I'm giving you all the information. I'm not telling you what to do. And I want you to feel that way. Come August, we're going to do our best. If you've hired a consultant, we will do everything in our power. We have models, we have analytics, we have the proposals. We will do everything that the procurement department allows us under the law to manage and provide. That will be, we'll be happy to do it. We don't want to hold anything back from anybody. We want to make sure this is fully transparent, and that's our job. That's why y'all hired us. And we want to make sure that y'all feel that way at the end.
Chris, just one quick question.
Yes,
Does GDS have any contracts with TVA? Had recently?
No,
No, right?
No, we don't, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll just mention, we've done a little bit of work for them years past on some energy efficiency potential studies, but nothing related to transmission or power supply. And even that energy efficiency stuff is quite a few years old. So we have no current business arrangements with TVA.
Thank you.
Okay, Chris, I appreciate that information,
Yes, ma'am.
that feedback on that subject, but I'm still a little leery. And I will be looking forward to trying to get a consultant. I'm pleased that there's not a time frame you have to work within. I just don't see how I can make that decision in that short period of time. I'm concerned about how the general public will be made aware of what's taking place. And I think in order for even if like gas and water, to make sure the general public understands what happened, we need as much time as possible, so they will understand whatever decision is being appropriate.
Just one more thing on that, Councilwoman Johnson, thank you for that too. And I know this is a huge deal, and we're grateful that those of you who could came today to hear this. I just heard this, by the way, for the first time on Tuesday. But I will tell you, just to clarify, and I think we may have said this, may or may not have said this up front, but from a process standpoint, the good news for you is that the decision will precede when it gets to you, because the board actually has the responsibility to actually decide something. You will get the consequence of that, right? Ultimately, you'll get, if there's contracts associated with it, to approve like we do today. So the benefit you have, I think, is that the pressure, if there's, to the extent there's pressure, it's on the Mlgw board to sort of make a decision before it gets to the city council. Just from a process standpoint, I just want to make sure that's clear. So I don't want anybody to think that it's, you know, a joint thing or whatever, but it's to me, it's really these five that they've got to decide something kind of first, and then you guys, that's just an order to clarify for folks who may not know that that's the case. But you're exactly right, and we want to make sure everybody has all the information they need, so when they do get it, to make a decision or approval of a decision or contract, that they've got what they need. So that's really the objective of this today and ongoing. So all of this stuff that we put out there for next steps is available to the public. It'll be open for questions, and we'll make sure there's ample time. And if someone thinks there's not, that's something to share. We'll make sure there is. We've never, through the IRP process or this one, wanted to shield information. So hopefully, even this process today is evidence of that. So just wanted to clarify. Carl.
Yeah, I just want to make one statement and comment. Number one, I think this was an excellent opportunity for not only us as board members, but our fellow councilmen to hear this, and I appreciate this opportunity. But I do want to say this based on Councilwoman Johnson's comment. Just as a board member, we're not going to rush through this process. I'm just letting you know this now up front. Everybody knows that we have the same questions as board members. We take this as serious as anybody else in this room. So I want you and the public to understand that this is a very critical, important decision that these 5 board members will have to make. And we take all of this serious. I just want to go on record and state that. This is not going to be an easy rubber stamp position, because TVA has been an incumbent for the past 80 years. We're going to look at it from a business standpoint and what is best for the ratepayers.
One thing I want to add, I just wanted to thank my colleague, Councilman Warren and Councilwoman Johnson, for raising an issue that I was, before I yield to you, Councilwoman Johnson, I was going to ask this question. But it was fully addressed. And I wanted to talk about just your objectivity in this entire process, being PDS's objectivity. Because I was going to ask the question, who are your clients, who are your customers? Because I think that's going to lend itself to the transparency. I don't see this as any different than if we hired a lawyer. One of the things, and I said this in our meeting, Councilwoman Johnson, we can have 5 different consultants. And each one of them can very well have 5 different opinions. But we have to decide which one is the most credible, which one that we believe. And so, I supported the consultant aspect of it, but we still, the question that we need to ask them too, do you have any contracts with TVA or myself, whatever the case may be? But the question that I had, and this I looked over to you, Ms. Patterson, as the when we look at the cities, the municipalities outside of Memphis that are part of Mlgw, and it sort of goes back to the current arrangement that we have right now. There are infrastructure costs that we've taken on to put plants in Germantown, in Barclay, in Collierville. If we choose to leave TVA, and then, but they decide, hey, we're gonna stay with TVA, would those capital costs continue, would Germantown and Collierville still owe us anything for that investment that we have?
The answer to your question is probably more complicated than, but there would be some discussion between the parties about what happens with the infrastructure that's in their areas and how costs will be allocated.
Okay. So wanted to ask that question. And then did GDS, well, let me say this for the record. I am not in favor of a 20-year contract that we got to get out of for only a 3% savings. I'd rather us toe the line where we are right now than get into an arrangement like that. However, did we contemplate did we compare those savings staying where we are right now to those different scenarios?
So the idea being that where we are right now is not the LTPA and that 3% whatnot. Correct. You are correct. We did not. Everything you saw today in this analysis, and it sort of followed the RFP process, was the idea, what's the best deal I could get with TVA from an economics perspective, not necessarily of terms and conditions. And so that was used as the basis. You know, I tried to highlight that a little bit on the one slide where I said, well, look, if you did go down the LTPA route relative to what you had today, right, it could be $30, $40 million a year in benefits. So you could sort of take that and say, well, your savings from where you are today relative to portfolio 9 would be $30 to $40 million higher a year relative to where you are today.
Okay. Now, one of the things, and I'm looking at slide 38, when there were some figures, and this is when you were talking about IRP real dollars and then IRP nominal dollars.
Yes, sir.
But then we got to a point where you levelize things, and so what I came up with, once you levelize things, we're looking at a scenario of those prices of only about, I think it came up maybe 2.75 to 3.75 alone as far as the savings once we factored threw in the transmission cost. So those savings, it's one of those things, if we were talking about and then we talk about those non-financial risks that we're talking about, we have to look at those. If we talk about a 3.25% savings over 30 years, based upon the uncertainty of doing something, those numbers, that delta, in my opinion, just is not big enough to justify the uncertainty of doing something here. And I was open to hearing these scenarios. I'm glad we finally have a number that's in the public domain of what it would cost to do so, but 3.5%, 4% a year, I think it's a risk too great for us to do something with those numbers. Thank you.
Just one question. You know, one of the things about the transmission lines you talked about was Mlgw needed to own those. They're coming in. Right now, TVA owns those transmission lines, correct? They own the lines that are coming in that you're talking about that we have to build?
Well, no, TVA delivers to Mlgw at 4 points of delivery, and there's some mixed ownership there. TVA does own the 500 kV network.
So TVA owns that. So what we're talking about is we're going to be building out what TVA already owns. And I think the point that you made was it wouldn't be wise for us to have someone else build that out because we wanted to own it and put us in the situation that we're in right now. Is that what it is?
Yes.
So we're essentially being held at ransom by who owns those lines, but we don't have an option to use those lines for an alternative route, or an alternative provider.
Yes.
So that's where that cost is. So I want people to realize that that's what's going on with the TBA situation is they have a monopoly on those lines right now because they own them. The only way we get out of a monopoly is we have to own the lines, or we have to get the federal government to say TBA has to let those lines be used. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay, thank you.
So I have one question. On the front end, you discussed reliability a lot. Going forward, out of the proposals that you submitted, were you able to do a future reliability study on those? And if so, what did it reveal?
So the reliability studies were conducted by MISO because if the decision were to be made where MLGW goes into MISO, MISO is going to be responsible for the reliability of MLGW system, just like TBA is today. So they ran a bunch of technical studies. We worked with them. We had them look at various scenarios, where to place the generation, different options on the transmission lines. And so what you see reflected here was the least cost option to maintain reliability.
We've got a couple of commissioners that have not had an opportunity. Commissioner Nash.
Can you give me,
Commissioner,
sorry, you really answered my question. In terms of the ones that you submitted, that they submit proposals, how reliable going forward, or did you see any problems in them being able to supply the citizens of Memphis on a continuous basis without any interruption?
Well, so we in the RFP process, we specified we want two 500 kV lines, 230 kV line, new Shelby, and new Allen substations. So that was MLGW's decision based on the studies that Siemens had performed and the studies MISO had performed. And so in those scenarios, they stressed the system in their models to make sure basically that the lights stayed on. So that's really independent of the bidders. MLGW came up with a plan. They sent that out to the markets to give us prices. But that plan is what all the parties, MLGW, MISO, and Siemens agreed would be reliable, secure, meet all the regulatory requirements. And so that's how that's been done.
Yeah, and along those same lines, you know, the resources in the portfolios for IRP 6 and 9, basically, we're doing that, right? They're providing that reliability, you know, in a similar fashion as TBA and for the future. So what we did in the RFPs, we said, look, this is the type of technology, these are the types of units, the number of units we need, and by doing that and getting folks to give you proposals, they're in essence giving you that same degree of reliability that we required from the IRP, but now it would be in an equivalent manner in terms of this analysis. So yes, it has been studied in the sense that it is supporting what the IRP concluded. We just got the technology from folks to give us actual cost for it.
Commissioner Poland, any thoughts, comments?
Let me follow up on that one. The reliability, we know what we're getting from TBA. It's published, whatever it is, 99, whatever. When we go to a co-op or a group of owners of power plants scattered all about in different conditions, different ages, different senses of repair, what can we expect? Seeing what happened down in Texas, seeing what is happening in some projects I have up in the Northeast. Are we in the same ballpark? Could we be at the prices that they're quoting?
Well, some of us remember August 2003 pretty well. You know, the big blackout that stretched from Detroit over to New York. Right, it kind of started a preponderance of folks getting very concerned about how reliability is assessed and managed and mitigated. And so, you know, I can't sit here and tell you, right, that your lights would never go out under an IRP portfolio 6 and 9. what was done, not by GDS, but by MISO and Siemens, was to say, okay, if I did portfolio 6 and 9, what is the expectation when I stress the system, when I drop transmission lines, when I lose generators, when load goes crazy, when the world's changing? And what they concluded is, yeah, you still lose, I mean, there's still an opportunity where the lights are gonna flicker or something like that, but it was a manageable situation. And you guys know better than anybody because you live with it, right? Your investments in your transmission, your distribution system are what you do to make sure the lights stay on and the reliability stays where it needs to do. Now all you need is the generation to flow. And so that's what we were trying to accomplish.
Okay. And just as a clarification point, we understand, and everyone should understand it, Mlgw, the distribution is to our homes, to our businesses within our Shelby County, whatever the Mlgw footprint. What we're looking at here, and we're trying to fix that also. We're getting better every day, right? And our system is much more reliable today. And if we can keep moving and getting it back up to full repair, we'll be in great shape. But what we're looking at here to acquire is that transmission of somewhere else. This thing also puts us in, if we buy the transmission lines, pay for them. I'm assuming you're paying just like a contractor, but you own all the risk, you own all the repairs, you own all the EPA issues, the NERC, the PERC, all the different acronyms that we use. Same is true if we do it with the power plant. Mlgw would look very different, or will look very different, should we add these entities. That's a big operation, which we don't have currently the talent. Have to recruit and pay the salaries. So that's just weighs a little bit. It should be understood. And I guess lastly, the TVA piece. You look at the 3.1 over whatever 20 years percent look like in these first 5 years, 170 million that would be rebated or however they're going to do. Dana, how much of the bond money was attributed to our to the electric company? We borrowed 2 years ago that we're doing all these improvements on.
So the bond money that I spoke of earlier, that's all related to our distribution and transmission electric.
Okay, only electric.
Yes, sir.
This 170 would be a good chunk of that. Yeah, I think that's all that.
Thank you, Commissioner. I'm going to wrap us up.
Hey, just a quick question before you do make if you were going to say anything about the reliability of TVA versus MISO, is there a difference between their reliability as far as the customer is concerned? Is MISO somehow inferior to TVA in reliability?
No, Dr. Warren, both MISO and TVA have to abide by the same set of reliability standards. That's promulgated by NERC. When they plan and operate their systems, they have to follow the same set of standards and rules. So Chris mentioned, when he showed the summer assessment that NERC ran, and they saw some problems in MISO for the summer. That's related to capacity, maybe the lack of capacity, units offline, it shouldn't be, early retirements, those types of things. But on the whole, TVA, Southern Company, Entergy, MISO all have to meet the same reliability standards.
And the issue that we had in Texas, most people don't understand what that was about. What caused that?
You had a lot of well, first of all, the temperatures were, record-setting cold. Record, deep cold in places they had not experienced that, in 50, 60 years. And so a lot of generating capacity that should have been there wasn't. Gas supplies, gas valves and pipelines froze. These units in Central and West Texas were not winterized like they are other states. And so the generation wasn't there to serve that really high demand for that cold weather period.
Yeah, it's a little bit of a shame in the sense that you could almost think of that as like a natural disaster, right? A hurricane flows through Florida. Nobody asked why the lights aren't on. A hurricane just came through. In Texas, not that, they're not prepared for cold weather. They're prepared for heat. Has anybody been to Texas? And so right there, their whole economy is built around that. Unfortunately, it was a confluence of bad events that hit at a bad time. And we'll see where Texas goes from this, right? What lessons do they learn? What do they put in place? I'm looking forward to it as well.
Because they're not really connected to anything, right?
That's
they're
right.
sort of isolated.
That's correct.
Mr. Pesci.
Yes, more of a comment and a summation on my part. I'm a new commissioner. I don't know how long I'll be titled new commissioner, but I am a new commissioner. As Cheryl, citizen of Memphis, I read an article that said if Mlgw left TVA, we could realize a cost savings of $417.8 million annually. Well, that got my attention. I thought of the schools, I thought of the streets, I thought of the infrastructure, how much a city like Memphis could do with over $400 million savings per year. When I was appointed and sworn into the board, I took a deep dive. And when I take a deep dive, I read everything. And won't let anyone talk to me and won't listen to anything. I take a deep educational dive. I've done that, I'm still doing that, and I'm here today because that's part of my process. I'm still looking for $417.8 million savings annually if we were to leave TVA. When I look at slide 46 in particular, and there are several other slides, honestly, I don't see that. My process continues because this process continues. But that is my comment on where I've come to today.
Thank you. Chris, Seth, great job today. There'll be opportunities for comments, questions on the portal. So this doesn't stop the conversation.